I remember the doors opening, jack-o'-lanterns and animatronics waving me into a world of spooky wonder. It was only October 4th, and I was already so excited for trick-or-treating I could barely breathe. I looked at the sign above, the generic Halloween store logo haphazardly plastered over the once bright and wonderful sign to Heidi's Playhouse, a back-in-the-day hybrid clone of both Chuck E. Cheese's and Toys R Us, one that apparently didn't exist anymore. I could recall the commercial for the grand opening, a comically tall mascot in a suit with an eyeball for a head, cutting a big ribbon with a large set of gold scissors. I recalled the cartoons airing on TV, but was too young to know it had gone bankrupt and closed, leaving a shell in a corner of the otherwise busy mall. The thought of it being painted over so easily made me feel strange, but the dancing ghosts and zombies inside were quickly changing my tune. "Come on, buddy, let's go see some scary stuff." My dad patted me on the back, and together we went in. As soon as I was through the doors, a blur of movement flashed before me, and a clown screamed with outstretched arms. I nearly jumped out of my skin, and my dad laughed. I recoiled at his menacing face, one that quickly melted away and said, "If you need help finding anything, let me know," before chuckling and dancing away. I felt tears welling, but my dad said it was just a joke and assured me that he was just trying to spread some Halloween spirit. In seconds, I had forgotten about the old Heidi cartoon, my world consumed by bags of candy corn and hanging costumes. The Halloween store was a magical place, with loads of decorations and disgusting props. Even a lady dressed as a witch behind the counter. My dad corralled me around the skeletons and prop heads, letting me get close, but not letting me touch anything. "Those are expensive. If we break it, we have to buy it." It was something he always said. A voice that echoed in my head every time I reached for the light-up pumpkins or giant spiders. It didn't matter if I couldn't touch them. Just being in the big, spooky world made my heart race so fast I thought I would pee myself. Hundreds of costume choices, anywhere from a zombie pirate to a giant donut. The bigger kids were crowded around the wall of masks, so my dad decided to avoid it, and distracted me with costumes from popular scary movies. I kept expecting that clown to pop out again, but I never saw him. We made several laps around the store, and each time I saw something I had missed previously. With each round, my dad got more and more tired, and I could hear the patience thinning in his voice. I still hadn't found a costume. I could tell we were about to go, and I was doing everything I could to keep us in this scary wonderland. Just as he was steering me towards the cash register, I thought of something that made my world come crashing down. We had never looked at the masks. I looked back at the wall of faces and saw the bigger kids had cleared out. I thought of the clown lingering and decided to chance it for an opportunity to see them. My dad was talking sweetly to the witch cashier, and she was leaning towards him, twirling a long lock on her finger. I tugged on his hand to get his attention, one he pacified by squeezing my hand in warning. "Well, I never really thought I could pull off a lumberjack, but..." "Dad, can I please go look at the masks, please?" I blurted, making both of them look at me. I could see my dad's flash of anger, one that seemed to fizzle away when the witch put her hand on his. He sighed and reluctantly agreed. "Only for a minute. Don't touch anything." But I was already gone, ready to have the whole wall of masks to myself. I dashed through rows of costumes, around a bucket of devilish pitchforks, and weaved through other customers as I made my way to the wall. I could see them clearer now, all of my Halloween spirit writhing in a torrent of anxious excitement. I burst out of an aisle and into the open wall, feeling dwarfed under the size of the collection. I looked for the clown and saw no sight of him. Without my dad trailing behind me, I suddenly felt very alone, the wall of masks staring down at me. I looked over each face. Some I recognized, others I didn't. A man with nails protruding from his face, the wild-eyed face of a man wearing someone else's face. A black unicorn with burning stars for eyes. I looked at each one, marveling at both the details in the masks and the feeling of dread they inspired in me. Despite my growing fear, I kept looking, each one more unsettling than the last. An unsettling white face with brown hair. A man with horribly burned skin. Something between the hangers caught my eye, and I found myself stopping. There was something hidden in the shadow, the faintest glint catching the lights from overhead. Like a mask had fallen down behind the others. It was roundish, and looked like it had a dot in the middle. I tried to see it better, but it was just too dark. I had to get closer. I looked for my dad and realized I was too far away from the register to see him. The store suddenly felt very empty, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I decided I would just take a peek and run back to him. I turned around and parted the other masks with my hand, trying to get a better look. It was round like a beach ball, a singular dot right at the center. I moved my face closer, the familiar shape slowly making sense in my head. After a moment, I realized it wasn't a dot, but a pupil. It reminded me of Heidi's Playhouse, but the realistic features made it look more unsettling than friendly. And there wasn't another one like it in the entire store. It was perfect, and I wanted it to be my costume. I reached for the mask, but it was too far away. I tried to worm my way between the hangers, keeping the mask in my view as I inched between them. When I reached again, one of the hangers caught my shirt, preventing me from going further. When I tried to shake it off, I felt something grab my hand. I looked to see long, black fingers wrapped around my hand, an icy grip that came from the shadows of the rack. I felt a sickening pit in my stomach and tried to pull away, but it wouldn't let go. The pupil on the Heidi mask dilated and blinked. Before I could scream, the hand yanked me into the wall and I blacked out. When I awoke, I felt the cold press of the floor on my face. I jumped to my feet and looked around, feeling a kindling panic when I didn't realize where I was. I was in an aisle, black and white checkered tile reaching for as long as I could see. There were shelves on either side of me, neatly organized toys, stacked high, until they almost touched the fluorescents above. "Dad?" I called out, my voice meeting nothing but dead silence. The aisle seemed to stretch forever. Hundreds of toys lining the path both ways. I found myself shivering, wanting desperately to go home. Next to me was a cardboard cutout, bold letters announcing the grand opening. Heidi's Playhouse. Join Heidi and his sidekick Shep the sheepdog on the greatest game of hide-and-go-seek ever. The cutout depicted an unusually tall and lanky man dressed in a suit, with a large eyeball serving as his head. Beside him was an adorable-looking sheepdog with sparkling eyes that stood on its hind legs like a person. It looked just like the cartoon I had seen on TV. At the bottom of the sign read its catchy slogan, "No one can hide from Heidi." A scream echoed down the aisle, and I looked to see the clown from the store. He was running towards me, flailing his hands. I'm not sure what frightened me more, the sight of him or the fact that he looked terrified. Oh kid, we gotta get out of here," he shouted, grabbing me by the shoulders. He was breathing hard, tears streaking through his clown makeup. I started to cry. "Kid, tell me, how did you get here? We need to find a way out. He's coming," he shouted, frantically looking back the direction he came. There was nothing but darkness, a billowing, shifting void that seemed to churn at the end of the aisle. "Who's coming?" I blubbered, lips trembling. "I don't know who he is. He's just not fucking right. We gotta go, kid. We gotta..." Suddenly, a large hand gripped the clown's shoulder and yanked him away, pulling so hard his oversized shoes kicked off his feet. The arm that grabbed him stretched from the darkness and held him up in the air, wrapping around his throat until he choked for breath. "No, please." I watched in horror as the arm slammed him down, an impact so hard it rattled the boxes on the shelves. The clown coughed and clutched at his stomach, and the long arm slithered away and into the darkness. "Run, kid, run!" He coughed, but he wasn't looking at me. From the darkness poked a large pair of golden shears, reflecting in the fluorescent light. The blades opened like a guillotine, worked by two long hands that gripped the loops fiercely. Following the shears stepped out an incredibly thin body, standing tall with a massive, bloodshot, spherical eyeball. I froze with fear as the scarily shaped Heidi crouched to keep his head from hitting the ceiling. He cast a shadow over the clown as he approached, who was holding his hand out in surrender. "You thought you could hide from me?" It spoke with no mouth, the massive eyes narrowing in front of him. "No." The blades closed, shearing the clown's arm and head from his body. The separated pieces flailed and sprayed, but Heidi was already opening the shears again to give it another go. He closed them again and then again, flinging a spatter of minced guts and bloody spray as he kept snapping the giant scissors. As red speckles peppered his giant eye, Heidi looked at me and stopped, snapping the shears at the air. I turned and ran, heading in the opposite direction as a piercing shriek emitted from the eyeball. The limbs skittered like a spider, closing the distance in seconds as I screamed. I woke in my father's arms, crying hysterically. We were sitting on the floor and he was rocking me back and forth as a crowd gathered around us. I was back in the Halloween store. The checkered tile beneath my feet was once again old, scuffed carpet, and Heidi was nowhere to be found. My dad asked me what happened, saying he found me on the floor crying by the masks. I told him everything. Heidi with his scissors and the clown in the long store-like hallway. The girl witch cashier suggested maybe I'd gotten lost in the back, and found some of the old store cutouts. She said Harv the clown was supposed to be grabbing more items to restock, and she would go get him to apologize. She returned moments later confused, saying he was nowhere to be found. Underneath the wall of masks, a red stain was growing in the carpet. Boss Video was dying. Plain and simple. Auburn thought of this while carrying stack after stack of DVDs to the counter, scanning them to reassure the inventory system was still running and aware of the stock. Panic Room, Secret Window, Kill Bill. One by one, she reduced the stack into another stack, while the clutter of the store seemed to grow out of control. It was easy work, but the back and forth and cultivating disorganization was starting to feel exhausting. Auburn finished the stack and leaned against the counter, wishing there would be a customer of any kind, to bring her away from the dead horse the store was starting to feel like. Across the rows of metal racks, Auburn watched a sweaty, overweight man delicately unhook an old triangular-shaped poster advertisement from the ceiling before breaking it down. The 2006 Silent Hill live-action adaptation promo had been hanging there for years before Auburn started to work there, and she found it funny that it had never been replaced by last year's sequel, or any other film for that matter. She checked the clock, watching the tired hands click over the sun-damaged backdrop of popcorn and candy. It was 8:03, just under an hour left to go. With her boss preoccupied and a DVD collection of Murder, She Wrote playing on a loop on the little television next to her, Auburn hunched over the front desk and flipped through this month's issue of Inked to temporarily forget the many copies of Cloverfield and Rob Zombie's Halloween. She flipped page after page, taking in every intricate design permanently imprinted on pale, slender bodies. Each photo shoot made her mind wander, contemplating whether she could pull off a specific back piece, a unique sternum tattoo, or perhaps a completely blacked out leg. There was a loud bang on the counter, and Auburn jumped, torn away from her magazine. Her boss, Ron, still had his arms held out from the bundle of cardboard cutouts he had let fall. He chuckled and gave her a smile, leaning against the counter in a creepy way that made her want to shit or vomit. Probably both. "I see you're working hard over here." The jab was expected, but still annoying. "I was just taking a second," Auburn said, closing the magazine and moving it away. Ron's eyes tracked the cover and lingered on it before looking at her. "Tattoos, eh? You didn't strike me as the type." He adjusted his glasses as he leaned in, and thoughts of the many passes he had made in her short time working there invaded her mind like a cancer. She could see the sweat collecting on his arms, and she tried to ignore the aroma that came with it. "And what type is that?" she asked, busying herself with another stack of DVDs, one she had probably already gone over. Anything to keep from looking at him. "Oh, you know. Anyway, I'm going to need you to start tidying up the racks tonight. I have a buyer coming in tomorrow to check the place out." "A buyer?" Auburn asked, raising her eyebrows. "Yeah, some cat from Chicago. Think they manage a chain of Halloween stores every season. Like that'll last. There used to be one here before I bought the place. Nothing really seems to last in this mall, but hopefully they can make me an offer. At least to cover what I put into this place. Those digital movies are fucking us. Before long, there probably won't be any stores like this, Ron said, unraveling some posters. New posters, to get a look at them. Big yellow letters stretched across the front, loudly saying things like, 80% off, clearance sale, everything must go. What the fuck? That's some way to say I'll be out of a job soon. When did you plan on telling me? Auburn looked at Ron incredulously. Now! And I'll need you to stay until 10 and lock up tonight. I'm gonna head out. He re-rolled the prints and set them behind the counter before grabbing one of the boxes of theater candy and tearing it open. He shook out a handful into his palm and knocked it back. What the fuck? It's Friday. I have less than an hour before I'm done, and you tell me now? Hey, Ron shrugged. I gave you a chance to smooth things between us, with all the times you've been late. By trying to fuck me in the back room? I'm 19. How old are you, 40? And what's to stop me from just quitting? Auburn got louder, and Ron looked around nervously in case anyone overheard. But there was nobody else in the store. In the end, he just shrugged again. Remember, I'm the one who punches you in and out. For all we know, you stopped showing up days ago, Ron said, heading for the door while Auburn seethed. 10. And don't forget to lock up when you're done. Auburn watched him go from the big glass windows, watching him confidently waddle to his shitbox of a car, like he taught her a lesson. When he got in his car and started it, he made a point to look back at her and wave before pulling away. Asshole, she said, giving him the finger. Auburn wanted to pack up then and there, thinking, fuck him. But when she looked around the store for a moment, the anger faded away. Even if the place was an outdated dump, she did like her job, and if this was her last day... The clock read 8:15. An hour and 45 minutes. Even if the place didn't sell tomorrow, tonight would be her last shift. Looking around the video store, her almost felt sad after that. The unpunctual knowing of the coming change. It's not like she'd apply at another video store. Even if Ron was a sweaty bastard pig, he was right about one thing. These stores were on their way out. She saw it coming for weeks. The straggler customers, Ron's erratic price fluctuation, the long-expired candy on the shelves. It was a Friday night, and their only customer had been Betty, the same lady that comes in every Friday night to rent When Harry Met Sally, far from record-breaking business. Standing silently at the counter, Auburn glanced at the little TV next to her, to Angela Lansbury piecing together another uncanny murder mystery. Even though it was one she'd seen before, hearing the sultry narrative and watching the grainy tube, a single thought nagged at her unexpectedly. She would miss this. For the next hour and a half, Auburn went back to work. But instead of slugging along like she had in the previous hours of the day, she walked around the store with a finality of bittersweet wonder. Even though Ron was, and probably always would be, a prick, there was a kind of magic that came with this place, especially tucked in the strip mall, that never really seemed to take off. There was an odd charm to the overpriced Wii U consoles, and the fact that there was always an abundance of copies of Cruel Intentions and The Skulls, forever encapsulated in a display that couldn't seem to move on from the early 2000s. As the clock ticked away, Auburn organized and neatened the racks of Boss Video's selection. Knowing her efforts on the appearance were the last someone would take the time to do before it got forgotten by time. She straightened cases that looked half-assed and rotated ones that had started to fade in the sun, and for a moment the store looked like it was trying to be the best it could. In the duration of the melancholy work, there had been no customers. Not even a phone call to check if something was in. A reminding sign of the change to come. By the time Auburn made it back to the front counter, she felt exhausted and finished. The show she had been playing on the little TV had run its course and sat tiredly on replay at the menu. And as she ejected it and packed it up for good luck, she felt thoroughly done with the store. That was until she caught the aroma of burning flesh. Auburn immediately looked to the dome mirror in the far corner of the room, one that gave her a round but wide view of the store's floor. She could see the shape immediately, but her eyes couldn't seem to make sense of the strange figure. Whatever it was standing in the kids' movie section, gray and oddly disproportioned. Her first thought was to call Ron, but she couldn't help but think it might have been a prank cultivated by him. He was known to keep tabs on the store after he left, usually in the form of a shitty security camera placed facing the counter. He said it was in case of a robbery, but he also admitted to watching the footage the next day to make sure things were up to par, a lie that meant he had been checking her out all night. Auburn looked at the security camera nervously, and noticed there was a little red dot glowing above the lens. It was something it had never done before, even when Ron was spying on her. She looked back to the dome mirror and saw the figure still there, and against her better judgment went to go investigate it. She imagined maybe a preteen was looking to get some early Halloween kicks in, or maybe even a homeless person had wandered in. But in the kids' movies? She left the safety of the counter, and with that her bag as well. She crossed the aisles, all the while keeping an eye on the dome. The thing was barely moving, its head sort of tilting as it stood in place. Her nostrils stung from the burning smell, like they had been standing there holding a blowtorch to the same charred piece of steak. She was surprised she couldn't see any smoke. When she passed the aisles of action films and rounded the corner, the figure finally registered. But it made even less sense. Standing in the middle of the aisle was a sheepdog. Not an actual dog, but someone wearing a costume like they were disguising themselves as one. The costume itself looked expensive but old, like something you would see at the closed-down Celebration Station or Chuck E. Cheese. The fur of the jumpsuit was dirty, stained, and burnt in places like it had barely survived a fire. The head looked too big amidst the stockiness of the body, like they were meant to be similar to a cartoon character. But there was a wheeze to them, like they were walking around with pneumonia. "Excuse me, is there something I can help you find? We're about to close." She felt shitty for tacking on the last part, but it was as close to passive-aggressive as she was willing to go. Maybe if she could help them find a movie. Perhaps one of the old Disneys with the big plastic case that would get the fuck out. The little person looked at her, and she immediately wished she hadn't said anything at all. The way it moved, nearly the entire body had to turn for the wearer to see her through the mask. The eyes of the dog were hollowed out, replaced by intense eyes that looked up at her. Vibrant blue irises with a bloodshot surrounding, and an unsettling feeling that Auburn had that they didn't have any skin. Whatever was hidden underneath looked dry and disfigured, but red like they were bleeding from everywhere. I'm sorry, I didn't see you when you came in. I would have said hi." Auburn fake chuckled, moving a lock of hair behind her ear. Something in particular you're looking to watch tonight? We have quite the selection." The eyes of the costumed person flicked across her from head to toe, like it was analyzing her. They lingered on her shoes, then her thighs, then straight to her breasts. The eyes narrowed before looking up at her face, with a grimace she could only describe as pure disgust. "Are you alone?" they asked, and Auburn felt a chill across her neck. The voice wasn't young and high-pitched, it was deep and hoarse, like an old man that smoked 3 packs a day. No. My manager's in the back room taking inventory," Auburn lied, feeling suddenly intimidated. "Should I go get him? He'd be happy to help you." She stole a glance at the security camera, at his glaring red eye. When she returned her gaze, the sheepdog was staring at her. He leaned to one side slowly and glanced behind her, toward the back room. "No need to get him involved," he said, side-eyeing the camera before looking back to her, his next words making her sick to her stomach. "Where are the children?" Auburn felt like she was shrinking in the video store. The sheepdog looked at her expectantly, each raspy breath getting louder the longer it watched her. She felt a horrible twist in her stomach, followed by the primal urge to run for the door. "I'm sorry. There aren't any kids here. It's getting pretty late, so..." She kicked herself for botching the reply, but the world seemed to be closing in around her. The red eye on the camera, the horrible, pained breathing, the intense blue eyes, it all seemed too much, and Auburn found herself pulling at the collar of her poncho, feeling it was too tight. The scent of burning wood and meat like a campfire scorched her throat. She looked at the door, thinking she could just leave. Call the police. The red eye watched. Before she could make a run for it, the sheepdog was face to face with her, eye level. She hadn't crouched down to his level. She had shrunk. Are you scared? His question exploded in her ears like he was speaking inside her head. She felt like her bladder would let go. No, His hand was placed on her arm. She couldn't tell when. The hard grip from within the fluffy, singed paw had wrapped around her wrist, like he wanted to break it. The large head of the costume was leaning in so it could whisper in her ear. When he did, she felt her bones shiver. The breath of seared meat was hot on her neck. Do you think they could hear you scream? If they did, would they care? Auburn awoke to darkness. A churning, shaken mass of black that shook her brain like a magic 8-ball. Her hands searched as her mind tried to right itself. Palms sliding against a grimy floor that radiated with the scent of rotten char, like maggots festering in a mound of damp ash. The tube TV reset the vertigo. A flash of blue that came with its own tonidal ringing, complete with the analog number in the upper right-hand corner that showed Channel 3. She stared at it like the snap out of a bad trip, sweating and sober and breathing heavily, flinching against the darkness. She expected the burned man in the sheepdog costume but could see nothing beyond the TV's glow. Only the VHS tape sitting in front of her. Auburn climbed to her feet and looked down at it. It resonated with the energy of a live bomb. Across the old white label was a scrawl of big red letters that had bled heavily before drying, like it had been written with a paint marker. Keep quiet. Keep eating. Auburn looked around again, pleading for some sign of an exit. Whatever was on the tape couldn't be good. She looked for a glimmer of light, mentally begging for a window, door, or even the crack of floorboards above. Wherever she was, the walls encased her with the solidity of cement. Swallowing hard, Auburn looked down at the videotape and sighed. Fuck. The tape felt clammy when she picked it up. The bulky plastic felt like it had been sweating, and left behind an imprint on the ground in the TV's glow. Stupid, so fucking stupid, I'm gonna die, she thought, holding the tape awkwardly as she squinted ahead. The TV was stationed on a cart, something you'd see shortly after finding you had a substitute for the day. Among the mismanaged cables was a VCR, waiting patiently to be fed. Auburn groaned as she crept toward it, holding the tape out as an offering. When she was close and her eyes adjusted well enough to see the receiver, she pushed the tape in. The drag of plastic on plastic echoed in the dark room, and when the flap slapped shut behind it, Auburn jumped. She looked at the player as the tape wound up, and as the sick feeling worsened in her stomach, she lifted her eyes to the screen. The screen continued blue for a time, but as the player started to whir, the color was replaced by a plaster of static snow. In the transition of the screen, Auburn couldn't help but see a new chilling detail in the tiny room she was in. In the far right corner, a little red eye had blinked to life. A security camera. Auburn watched the snow fade into a black and purple haze, followed by streaks of more static. She could see the tape getting there, and her palm started to sweat. She hoped for a rerun of Barney, Richard Simmons, or maybe even some Ty Bo. But as the screen started to play the film, she realized she was getting nothing like that at all. The audio was first, grainy and scratchy. It came through in segments, distorted by years of dust and damage. A man's voice filling the small room like a home theater. Don't you fucking... I swear to God, Daddy, please don't. It hurts. Just do what they say. Heidi will get mad. I'll kill you, you understand? The screen showed a man restrained, violently struggling against several people holding him, each of them wearing masks. In front of him is a little blonde girl with another masked individual behind her. She's held at knife point. Behind her is what Auburn assumed is the rest of the family, the mom and two younger boys. They're seated at a dinner table, the mom lamenting muffled screams against a rectangle of duct tape. It's hard to make out through the quality of the recording, but it almost looks like their legs are wrapped in barbed wire. Auburn felt the rush of bile from her stomach but kept it down, having no choice but to look and watch. Even in the chilly confinement, she was sweating. The screen cuts, more static black, then picks up again. Same seating at the table, same girl at knife point, same father. He's still trying to resist, but he looks like he's been beaten. Weakly, he reaches for the daughter, the sons, his wife. The children are silent. The mom is out of breath, reduced to sobbing. The masked men part to make way for another group of similarly dressed people, but one that's led by a shorter, fully costumed individual. The fur on the costume is pristine, fluffy even, like it's ripped straight out of a kid's commercial from the 1990s. The sheepdog. The sheepdog looked at the father and daughter, then to the family, almost lazily, indifferent. It's then that Auburn can see something in its hand, sticking out amongst the fluff. A bulky, handheld power drill with a cord dangling behind it like a leash. The tip is one of those spade bits used for cutting a hole in wood. The men accompanying him are carrying equally crude tools, a beveled chisel and a brass mallet. "Let her go! Let them go! You can have me, please!" The audio is distorted and doesn't quite match up, but drones over and over the background noise of the kids silently crying and the mom shaking against her wooden restraint. The sheepdog looked at the father, his emotionless caricature face watching as he begged. Without a word, the sheepdog motioned to the girl, and they seat her at the table as the father tried again to break free, but to no avail. Auburn watched as they closed around the father, tears welling as they each took a turn, while the others wrapped the same barbed wire around the little girl's legs. The brass mallet was first, a quick but heavy hit against the side of the father's head. A spasm follows, and the mom screamed against the duct tape. The beveled chisel punctured the side of the neck, rending the flesh and making way for a grisly arterial spurt. The children are silent and look away. The sheepdog appeared bored, holding the drill at its side. He looks at the face of every victim lazily, father to kids, kids to mom, before he started digging in with the drill. Slow, curious presses to see what damage it would inflict. The chest, the stomach, the face. The screen cuts again and Auburn vomited. A weak splash from a nearly empty stomach, followed by the burn of bile in her throat. When the screen changes again, she doesn't want to look, but she does. The masked men drag the father away, leaving a smear of blood behind. One of the masked men is playing in it, coating his fingers before he finger paints on the wall out of sight. The children are silent, and the mom weakly groans against her restraints, visibly destroyed, her eyes bloodshot and haggard. The sheepdog walks over to her, the cord of the drill trailing behind him. With his fuzzy paws, he struggles to remove the duct tape. Another screen cut. Distorted static, black and purple haze. The sheepdog is gone. Two masked men work a mop and bucket on the smear left behind by the father, the steam rising as a worked lever squeezes red water from the mop's head. The children are transfixed on something on the wall, something written out of sight. The mom is hunched on the table, duct tape still half stuck over her mouth. The drill is embedded in her temple and left there, the cord trailing on the floor. Auburn cries as the screen cuts again. The floor is clean and the mopping crew is gone. The men in masks have vanished and there's a squeak of sneakers on tile. A new masked man comes in, garbed in a bloody apron carrying a platter of meat. Set in front of each child is a plate, a fork, and a knife. Despite everything, they watch the same spot on the wall. The tape has ended. Auburn watched the dull glow as the video faded away, leaving behind an unsure mess of dark static film. She continued to watch for a time, uneasy seconds spent crying as she questioned the meaning of it all. The red eye in the corner shut off, leaving Auburn with nothing but the off black of the TV screen and the noises of the empty tape in the VCR. A door didn't unlock. There was no sudden realization, no further instructions. Standing there awkwardly, she wondered if she should rewind the tape, or maybe... The screen of the TV exploded, a hail of glass ricocheting off the empty room as Auburn held up her hands. The light that followed was blinding, a searing spotlight that burst from the remnants of the tube's husk. A single eye, angry and radiating with light, inky black limbs that pulled itself from the glass, and a shattered mechanical voice that was so loud she felt herself shrinking to the floor. "You thought you could hide from me?" The borderline dial-up voice shattered Auburn's eardrums as the oily form made its way across the floor and above her impossibly fast. "You're fucking dead, you stupid bitch. I found you." The appendages moved like tendrils, tar-coated feelers that navigated and moved across her body, all the while holding the massive eye the size of a classroom globe so it could stare directly into her soul. The eye flexed and squinted, the pupil dilating as the strands wove around her, pinning her and imprisoning her to the floor. An arm propped itself on an elbow and snaked around her neck, constricting around her throat as the massive eye loomed above. The other one snaked under her shoulder and spread across her chest with groping feelers, searching, grabbing, twisting. The grip of the autonomous eye strengthened, and Auburn felt the air push from her lungs under its weight, a weight that brought with it the sensation of pain. With a sudden pull, the entwining limb lifted, tearing her polo, snapping her bra strap, and ripping her breast from her body, yanking it from her in a peeled layer that exposed writhing, pulsing muscle. As she watched the strip reveal her bare abdominal tissue and struggle against the bind of her studded belt, all the while serenaded by the screech of the tentacle eye monstrosity, so loud it deafened her own screams. "Nobody hides from her." Auburn woke, drooling on stuffy, well-trafficked carpet. Her mind weighed 100 pounds and her limbs were hung over, shaking as they grasped purchase on the cold metal next to her. Getting to her feet, she found herself in the kids section of Boss Video, a damp spot forming on the floor where her head had rested. There was a fog in her brain, but the memory of barbed wire, mop buckets, and unimaginable chest pain squirmed beneath it. Her thoughts scrambled to piece everything together, a garbled, blended mass that distracted her from the sweat that seemed to be freezing on her skin. Letting out an exhausted, foggy breath, her eyes locked onto the clock, the sun-damaged backdrop of popcorn and candy standing out on the far wall. 3:17 a.m. Auburn felt the urge to run, and she indulged it. Her feet pushed off the carpet, the air in her lungs feeling chilled, sparse. She ran until she slammed into the counter, reaching only to grab the bag that held her keys and wallet and a well-worn DVD before pushing off to the front door. She could hear a wriggling behind her, an aggravated mass converging on her location, along with the metallic grunge of steel on steel. The footsteps that followed were heavy and wet, pounding across the carpet like an amputated spider, gaining on her, charging up. She pushed through the double-glass doors just in time to hear the fast slice of closing shears. There was a quick pull on her hair, one that fell away as she hit the pavement outside. The night was cool and silent, the sky lit by the light pollution of fast food chains and gas stations that never slept. Auburn felt the back of her head and examined her hand. There was no stickiness of blood, only the collection of freshly cut strands on her fingers. She looked back into the store. The racks and posters and movies lit up for all to see. For a moment she could see it standing there, the twisted limbs dripping as they hoisted the large pair of sharp, golden scissors. The massive eyeball watched atop its slithering form, twitching under the weight of both the head and its weapon. Chest heaving from exhaustion, Auburn watched it from the sidewalk and gave it the finger. It opened the blades once more, and when she blinked, it was gone. Amy looked at the sign across the parking lot and fidgeted nervously. It seemed to look back at her like a glaring eye, standing ominously in the distance. Even from the sidewalk, she could read it. The generic blood-drip font of orange and black clinging weakly as the wind tried to tear it away. Simply labeled Spooky Store, it barely covered the years of dried adhesive that had been collecting since before she was born. A rebrand of someone's bright idea that didn't make enough money and closed shortly after. It was the same old story that had played out for almost every business that decided to rent a portion of the forgotten shell that had once been known as Basemore Mall. She was too young to know the wide empty halls of the interior, and the magic of penny fountains and niche shops, but old enough to know that the only thing that had survived the dead mall was a franchise gym and a rotating style of Asian restaurants. That, and the annual seasonal Halloween store. Growing up through the years, she would marvel at the signs through the backseat window, and every time her mother would drive a little faster until it was out of sight. She never understood her mother's distaste for Halloween, but more importantly, her hatred for that building in particular. It felt like she was being punished every year. The leaves would change colors, and her classmates would discuss their costumes, and she would be envious, knowing the only festive change in her house would be her mother drinking more than she usually did. No trick-or-treating, no cute costume, no candy. Only unspoken secrets, and the law that she was never to step foot within 100 yards of the mall, no matter who she was with. End of story. Amy didn't mind the ban at first. When she was a child, she would always get her fill of the season in the form of the little costume selection at Walmart, and the same festive cartoons that played on cable each year. But as she got older, she found herself unable to understand her mother's unending hate for the holiday, and borderline hysteric stress that exploded every time she asked to go to the Halloween store. Her mother kept many secrets. She never went into detail on why she hated Halloween so much, or why her father wasn't around, or why she always covered up the twisted scars on her legs, or why in the fall she would drink until she fell asleep on the couch. These were all things her mother assured her she would learn when she was old enough. Luckily for Amy, amidst her mother's mysteries, the internet was more than happy to oblige her curiosities. A simple Google search provided more than she could ever ask for. An entire timeline of records that served as the legacy of Bastemore. Every store that attempted to put down roots, pages of failed hotspot restaurants, ambitious dojos and clothing stores. There was even a Halloween store that had burned down. Some kind of tragic accident that had made the news. Handy's Funhouse? Something like that. She couldn't remember the name. Her hand felt around the case of her phone in the front of her hoodie, and she pulled it out and unlocked it. No texts, no missed calls, and it was 8:45. The place would be closing soon. Come on, Chris. The lot felt too secluded standing next to the gym. Even at this time of night, she counted over 30 cars, which seemed off next to the almost completely vacant lot. The right side of the store was neighbored by an abandoned Sears garage. One of the things Amy discovered was a thing back in the day. The windows were busted, and she could barely make out the outline of forgotten equipment through the garage doors. The longer she looked, the more it looked like something was moving around in there. Just as she was starting to get antsy, her eyes were pulled away by clumsy movement on the left, past the rows of parked cars. Someone was waving in front of the gym, a silhouette in the fluorescent glow that carried across the lot. Baggy sweatshirt, clunky boots. Had to be her. Amy started jogging across the lot, shivering against the cold that was wafting in. The person ahead kept waving, 12 inches of extra baggy sleeve flopping around as they did. When they finally spoke, Amy heard a familiar voice and finally relaxed. "Hey, I'm sorry I'm late. My stupid brother dropped me off at the pharmacy and my phone died," Crystal said, meeting her halfway. "He's so rude. I wasn't sure if you were going to make it. They close in 15 minutes, Amy said, looking at the store. A couple was walking out, the boyfriend holding up a mask against the store's glow as he inspected it. Like some sort of skinned human face. The girlfriend didn't look thrilled. "Come on, let's get you in there before they close. My brother said he'd come and get us in 20 minutes. Amy and Crystal hurried across the small lot to the spooky store, just as the couple started their car. Amy watched them pull away, their headlights cutting through the night as they left them alone in the lot with a single car remaining. She ignored the creeping feeling and focused on the door instead, and felt her stomach drop as someone on the inside was making their way to lock it. No, Crystal shouted, throwing her hands up as they hit the entrance. Just as the guy inserted the key, Crystal started pounding on the door. He looked at them both for a moment before giving an exaggerated sigh like he was dying on the inside. He pulled the key out and cracked the door just enough to poke his head out. Sorry, kids, we're closing. Come back tomorrow. The guy was a handful of years older than them. Maybe a senior in high school. Can you let us in, please? Just for 10 minutes. My friend's never been in one of these stores. Crystal pleaded, motioning to Amy. The guy looked at both of them, but didn't move the door. Your friend can come back tomorrow. We're open at 11. We close at 9, which is in 10 minutes. Besides, aren't you two a little young to be out this late? Where's your parents? They know you're out here? Give you a permission slip? He teased. Something Crystal's brother would say. Is that even a thing anymore? Come on, my friend's going back home tomorrow, out of state. This is our only chance. We'll be quick, I promise. Don't be a boomer, Crystal said, and the guy sighed again. He looked at Amy and narrowed his eyes, taking note of her long black hair poking out from her hoodie. Where are you from, kid? He asked, opening the door a little. California? Amy blurted out the first thing that came to mind, fidgeting with her phone in her front pocket. They don't have Halloween stores in California? He asked, frowning. Nope. He looked at her for a moment before looking back into the store and groaning deliberately. 10 minutes, that's it, he said, opening the door and letting them in, before adding, Please don't break anything. I already straightened up. We won't, Crystal said, leading the way. Amy felt a surge of both excitement and relief as they passed through the doors, and out of the cold. The employee trounced back to the counter and leaned against it impatiently, scrolling through his phone in defeat. Inside the spooky store was pure magic. Amy marveled at the overwhelming festivity, the loud and vibrant assortment of costumes, figurines, and miscellaneous merchandise. The entryway was dominated by a collection of animatronics, each equally loud and intimidating. A bulbous-headed alien creature with glowing purple eyes that hummed as he held up a strip of human skin like a trophy. A large deer with flesh hanging from its antlers that would exhale smoke. A tall, half-woman, half-unicorn, covered in leather, chains, and blood. All the while hyped up with the backdrop of recorded screams of agony. This place is so cool, was all Amy could manage, in awe of it all. Crystal was already picking through a plethora of t-shirts, each covered in popular horror icons. She pulled away to gush over a plastic calico cat that would shine light from its mouth when you squeezed its paw. Yeah, it is. Glad we finally got you in here. Don't see why your mom hates it so much, Crystal said, leaving the cat behind after wincing at the price tag. Yeah, I don't know. She doesn't talk about it, Amy said, looking over the costumes. Inflatable hot dog suits, a bloated car salesman get-up with blazer and sunglasses, a rubber horse mask with bulging eyes. Oh, hey, I'm gonna go check out the makeup real quick. You wanna come with? Crystal asked, toying with her pastel-dyed hair. Go ahead. I want to see the mask before I go. Meet you back there? Amy said, grimacing against the ear-piercing screams of the animatronics. Cool. Don't get lost, Crystal said before hurrying away, her bulky boots scuffing the carpet. Amy navigated the store on her own with wonder, taking in each compelling prop and decoration. A stuffed swan with gore hanging from its beak. A life-size dummy of a skinned man, standing next to one that had its mouth open so wide it had ripped through its cheeks. There were so many cool and visceral things, but Amy could see it for what it was. Exciting but harmless fun. No nudity, no vulgar language. She didn't understand why it took her sneaking out to finally experience it. In the back of her mind, she felt guilty for being here, an incessant nag that pulled her through her excitement. But there didn't seem to be anything wrong with the place, and she started to wonder if her mother's hate from the place stemmed from some kind of superstitious illusion. Maybe she was just easily scared. She found a shelf of cartoony weapon replicas along the way. Reaper scythes, meat tenderizers, anime swords, and bloody meat hooks. On the floor was a comical pair of oversized red plastic scissors about 1.5 feet in length. It had been ripped from its packaging, the little zip tie still clinging to the loops. Amy picked them up and closed the fake shears a few times, wishing she could buy them. She decided to hang on to them so she could turn them in on the way out. The wall of masks was just as cool as she had hoped. From helmets to realistic animal replicas that had movable jaws, there had to be over 100 hanging on the wall before her. Amy whipped out her phone and stood back to take a picture, trying to get as many of them in the frame as she could. As the camera focused, one of the masks on the right stood out. One that looked much more realistic than the others. It was a child's face, with pale skin and horrified eyes. Both hands clasped over the mouth like it was trying to suppress a scream. Looking at it through the phone, she realized it wasn't actually hanging on the rack, but staring at her through the glass behind it, in the hallway of the mall itself. "Crystal?" Amy called, the jolting feeling in her gut subsiding to the thought that she was probably just being pranked. Crystal had donned a mask and waited to scare her, for sure. But when she lowered the phone, she didn't see a little girl, only a large metal door. One that was hanging acutely ajar. Amy looked around the store and found herself alone. She looked for Crystal amongst the boxes of decorations and lights, and saw nobody standing between the empty aisles and old carpet. The makeup section had been empty as well. She found nothing around the packets of plastic eyelashes and fake blood pints. She even peeked around the animatronic display to see if she could see the employee at the counter, but he was nowhere to be found. "Guys?" she called out and heard nothing in return. No screaming sound effects, no laughter, and no ambiance over the speakers. Everything had fallen suddenly quiet. Had they really left her here? Amy looked at the door and chewed at her lip nervously. She could just take a quick look and come back in. Maybe the employee had gone back there and she could chalk it up to a misunderstanding. She swiped out the camera on her phone and checked the time. 9:56. "Crystal?" she called again, and got nothing but silence. She sighed and took another worried look around the store and approached the door. Even ajar, the exit was heavy. Amy pushed into the hall, immediately aware of its vast liminal space. The air was cold, like she had just stepped into a refrigerator. The tile reflected the same ambient light from the store, a faint glimmer that reached down the left of the empty hall until it reached the barricade of a scissor gate. The corridor was littered with a pile of old props. A melted mannequin with rusted chains for arms, with a head that was too small. A realistic corpse wrapped head to toe in shriveled plastic wrap. A plastic unicorn with a broken stomach and a singed mane. All of them watched her with blank stares, underneath a film of dust from their home amongst the trash. Despite their uncanny appearance, the only thing that made her uncomfortable was the shape lingering on the right, positioned so it peeked at her from around a corner. The little girl with the horrified face, its little hands clasped over her mouth. Even in the darkness, she could see the haunted eyes, puffy and tortured. The child lingered like a cardboard cutout, her existence standing still like a copy-and-paste image. The more Amy looked at it, the more the pained eyes looked fake, until it started silently crying. Behind her, the metal door slammed shut. Amy jumped and tried the handle, feeling her stomach tighten when the hooked handle refused to turn. "Very funny, Crystal, let me in!" Her voice carried down the hall, a dying echo over the darkness that had overtaken the tile. With the door closed, it had gotten so much darker, and when she looked through the little pane of glass, she started pounding on the door. Inside the spooky store, the lights were off. "Crystal!" Her throat felt suddenly hoarse, and her words came through a haze of fog. The hall was freezing, and she shivered in her hoodie. Clutching the plastic scissors, Amy looked down both sides of the hallway. She swiped down on her phone and clicked on the flashlight, but the shine felt useless in the vast corridor. Panning the light left, the minute glow cast over the barricade, causing a dance of shadows behind it. Shadows that seemed to turn and look at her. When she turned right, she caught a glimpse of the little girl, and what looked like blood leaking from her eyes, right before she slipped out of sight. "Hello?" Amy called, the phone shaking in her hand. She tried the door again, wanting nothing more than the joke to be over and to see Crystal or the employee flick on the lights, but there was nothing but darkness, one that seemed to worsen whenever she wasn't pointing her phone at it. The absence of light crept around her, swallowing the air as it grew. Shivering in the dark, she looked through her phone to find Crystal's number. She hit the call button and watched it immediately go to voicemail. Instead of hearing Crystal's personalized recording, she heard something else that made her sick to her stomach. "Hey, sorry I'm late. My stupid brother dropped me off at the pharmacy and my phone died." The voice distorted towards the end, Crystal's cheery tone warped by loud static. As Amy looked at her phone hopelessly, a blood-curdling scream rang through the hall, one that was cut short by a sharp shick, followed by a heavy drip of fluid. The scream sounded like Crystal. Amy aimed her phone in the direction of it, her fingers wrapping tight around the plastic shears at her side. She saw nothing but the pale glow over the stretch of tile, the length of hall that seemed to shorten the longer she looked at it. Amy's lip quivered and her eyes welled as the realization settled in, the void closing in around her until there was nothing else to do but go down the corridor. Her shoes squeaked on the tile as she started walking, heading in the direction of the scream. The light from her phone weakened the closer she got, and she found herself moving quicker because of it. By the time she made it to the corner, she discovered the sounds of her shoes, and the huff of her own breathing had faded away, replaced by the low chorus of what sounded like sobs. As the light withered away, Amy stood at the edge of the corner, unable to bring herself to round it. She could hear breathing, a deep, bestial groan accompanied by a heavy, beating heart. She could feel it through the wall, a heavy thump-thump that vibrated through the soles of her shoes, one that started to move closer. It came around the corner slowly, a twitching shape that failed to make sense under the dwindling light. Two twitching points were first, jabbing through the dark like a feeler. They were long and visually sharp despite the skin that had been stretched over it, a car's length of blades that closed slowly in a shrill drag of steel on steel. The body that followed was an abomination, a writhing mass of movement trapped beneath patchwork flesh. Multiple legs carried it, a mixture of humanoid, arachnid, and canine appendages, working together like a top-heavy centipede. The monstrosity turned to face her, a prison of trapped limbs squirming against a see-through skin and veins. The shears swayed above, connected by a scorpion's tail of twisted muscle and cartilage. Amy's phone grew weaker by the second, and she watched through the shaking as the living shears stopped their sway, pointing directly at her. The heartbeat got faster, louder as the beast groaned. The stitches split vertically in a gaping maw of jagged teeth, a slow part that revealed a single glaring eye hidden beneath. Above her, the scissors opened wide, a horizontal guillotine that started to shake once it reached max capacity. Amy watched the eye glinting, its pupil dilating as her light died away to nothing. In the darkness that remained, she could feel its gaze, patiently observing her. Her shuddering chest, her quaking legs, her fleeting hope. Then, all there was left for her was a long breath to feed a scream. The banner was visible from the highway, a shade of orange that screamed for attention, even amidst the stain of autumn in the trees. John Carmichael thought it looked radioactive, the kind of color to warn of perilous drops and live wires. It irked him as it drifted through his peripheral vision, and he chewed his nicotine gum a little faster. In the back seat, 3 children, one his own, yammered incessantly about Ninja Turtles and Grim Reapers, pinheads, and someone named Jason Voorhees who John hadn't met. John's wife, Delilah, had roped him into taking the boys shopping for Halloween costumes. He had agreed on the condition that the following day, everyone would leave him alone so he could watch the Indianapolis Colts lose again in peace. As he made his way along the surface streets and turned into a strip mall on Myers Boulevard, he regretted his bargain. The lot had once contained 2 fixtures, a tumble-down furniture store that had possibly been a mob front, and a church. Now an immense slab of a building stood in their place. John's gum had lost its flavor, and that intolerable orange jeered his nerves into an unpleasant tightness from 2 proud masts atop the building. The boys in back were not so needled by the sight. "I'm so excited," His son Louis chirped shrilly to his friends. I know, 4 freaking acres of costumes. Benny, Don Claiborne's kid, strained at his seatbelt to get a better look. They've probably got every costume ever made. 4 acres? That has to be wrong, John thought. The place was large, to be sure, but buildings weren't measured in acres. Farms were. John must have been showing his confusion. Terry must have noticed.
The ad on TV said there's more underground, Mr. Carmichael. Lots more.
Terry's voice always sounded to John like the boy had an interminable head cold. His wide pink face smiled hopefully from the center seat. John mulled over the information and tried to look unperturbed. For the past 3 Halloweens, Terry had dressed as Dracula. John saw no reason why his shopping shouldn't go quickly. Maybe the others would settle for easy finds as well. All right, get out, boys. John could feel a headache coming on. He needed a drink. And a cigarette. But he doubted that violently orange Heidi's Playhouse had either. As they hurried across the parking lot, John freshened his gum and idly counted cars. He'd expected a more modest turnout for the grand opening of a costume shop, but it occurred to him that he'd been lucky to find a parking spot so quickly or at all. A thin forest of adults mustered in the distance, tight faces and bored faces all interspersed with mylar balloons, painted to look like eyeballs. The underbrush of children, it seemed, had been hidden by the cars.
Oh, we'll be in last place,
Terry moaned miserably as they strafed the line. When they settled into last place, John chewed, fantasizing about smoking. A gaunt stranger in a slim red suit nudged Terry with his foot. This ain't a race. The man looked like a pimp, overly tall and posing smugly against the wall of the building. But God help you if it were, eh, Moon Pie? He puffed out his cheeks and curled his bottom lip into a pout. Louis and Benny looked to be processing the jab. Terry was a chubby kid and, by John's estimation, an overly sensitive one. If this loudmouth prick was going to turn John's tiresome outing into a prepubescent esteem-building fiasco, John had half a mind to punch the guy in the jaw. Hey buddy, he's a kid, lay off. John tried to sound firm instead of agitated. The pimp grinned, one gold tooth shining cartoonishly from the side of his smile. He's a fat kid, buddy. Although I suppose he couldn't ask for a better place than a costume shop. He bent at the waist and brought his face down to a breath's reach from Terry's. The guy was spindly, crooked, reeking of cheap cologne that might as well have been gasoline. Oh, don't cry, Butterball. You could go as a glazed ham for Halloween. Terry's chin curled, threatening a sob. Louis and Benny both looked to John, searching for help. Hey, asshole, shut your mouth and leave the kid be. Christ! The pimp stayed bent eye to eye with Terry. His sidelong glance climbed to John's face and his grin soured into something sharper. Or what, Daddy? His tone was mocking, greasy. John wasn't exactly in a mood to fight, though in a fair scrap he figured he could probably take the guy. Most of all, he didn't want to make a scene in front of a herd of happy children. But he stepped forward all the same, balled up his fists. Joking, the guy unfolded, jarring glee stretching into his stringy cheeks. It was a joke. A trick. He chuckled, cackled crazily. Don't worry, Dad, I've got a treat as well. Shep? The man's treat was a child draped in moppish strands of cloth. A dog costume, John supposed. The dog scampered toward them, took to all fours, sniffed at Louis's crotch, then Benny's. Benny giggled. Sit, boy. The dog cooed, cocked its head to the amusement of a handful of children who delightedly echoed Benny's command. Sit, boy. Go on, sit. John was distracted, surveying the line when Benny yelped. The dog had bowled him over and was humping feverishly as a group of boys, Louis included, howled with laughter. Benny wasn't so amused. He struggled, red-faced, as the dog boy panted theatrically and dragged a pink costume tongue over the side of Benny's face. The pimp drew on a cigarette and smirked. The guy was getting on John's nerves. Hey, Red, your kid, Shep, has had his fun. Too right. The pimp flicked his cigarette and snapped at the dog to heel. Benny yelled as the brat sidled off of him. and John tugged Benny to his feet. The poor kid's pride was wounded, John saw that, but Benny sniffed instead of crying, and Terry was almost smiling again, and John just wanted to be done with the whole venture and get home to his sofa. Again, he checked the line. No movement. "Oh, I wouldn't worry much about the weight," the pimp said astutely. Somehow, from somewhere, he had found a sizable white beach ball streaked with red. He smiled toothily. Whatever his game was, it was growing more obnoxious, and John was feeling more violent. "Buddy, I've about had it with..." "Kids, I know. You." The pimp's smile dropped. "Because of Shep? Bad Shep." The dog peeked out from around a thicket of children and whined. "I'm sorry." The dog's voice was unexpectedly hoarse, grating, and John wondered if the pimp might be the kind of parent to slip his kid a pack of smokes from time to time. "Daddy 12 steps," the pimp shouted, pointing a very breakable-looking finger. "You, Ham Hock, Humpty Dumpling, and the other one, your treats await. Escucha." He lifted the beach ball over his head, lowered it, twisted it in a quarter turn, and stared down at them, masked in one colossal eyeball. It matched the balloons tugging haphazardly at their strings, which meant that the pimp was involved with the building and the crowd and the toxic orange banner. John's day was getting worse. The pimp slinked away from the line and spread his long arms wide. "Welcome, you lucky urchins, to Heidi's Playhouse. The creepiest, weepiest, upside-down, steeplest place on earth. More masks than a Venetian orgy, and more frights than a Chinese airport. You can push, you can scream, you can run, but remember, no one can hide from Heidi." The freak pointed to a black mesh pupil the size of a saucer, sat in the center of the mask. John tried to stifle a mean laugh, then didn't. "Very, entertaining." The eyeball dropped his pose and loomed over John like some giant wilting lollipop. Almost whispering, he said, "Our animal costumes are in the basement, but you'll have to find a friend if you're going to be a horse's ass." John had never punched someone in the eyeball. He mused about the possibility of such a thing making the news. Perhaps his friends and co-workers would call John a tightly wound thug if he did it. But just maybe he could convince them that he'd been right to do it. He bit decisively at his gum, and the pimp, Heidi, threw his giant head backwards. "Follow me, kiddies." Lewis beamed. Terry squealed, both embarrassing. Only Benny seemed appropriately put off. He side-eyed the dog wearily, and the dog, Shep, skulked between legs in the crowd. Heidi capered on ahead, stopping occasionally to tug at a sleeve or nearly grope a breast. "You can come along. And you. Enchanté." "Not you. No mask I've got is going to scare more people than that face. Sorry, guy." The boys followed their carnival messiah, and his chosen few swelled. An Indian couple and their two polite children. A young bedraggled mother with a boy Lewis's age. A large-haired Dolly Parton type and her Rolex-wearing husband. Their brood of Game Boy playing zombies. At the head of the queue, a wide black ribbon luffed between two traffic cones, and John wondered if he would somehow be forced into the pageantry. He felt victimized, unfairly targeted by a man-child and his slapstick dog-child companion. Perhaps Heidi had a sense of dwindling patience, and had selected John out of pure cruelty. Heidi probably had no comfortable sofa to go home to, and perhaps that is what made him such a sadist. John grumbled to himself. He had no clue how long his fingernails had been excavating little half-moon grooves out of his palm. Heidi stooped between an empty concrete planter, hoisted a pair of enormous novelty scissors into both hands. They, like Heidi's tooth, were gold, but of course they were. Heidi wore his mask, but he was every bit the pimp he'd been without it. "Thank you all so much, please. No applause necessary." No one had been clapping, but one or two parents awkwardly began to after being let off the hook. Warped courtesy. They probably had office jobs with cute, quippy coffee mugs and company polo shirts, and places of prominence in their local PTAs. John made a note to never leave the construction business. "Too kind," Heidi continued, patting the air quiet. "As you undoubtedly already know, I am the incomparable Heidi. A demon summoned from the strip malls of Gehenna to give you frights, chills, and savings. And this is, somewhere is my right-hand mutt, Shep. Shep barked. Somewhere, a PTA treasurer chuckled sycophantically. Heidi monologued. His Playhouse was apparently not just a store, it was an experience. A winding Xanadu of cheap thrills and obscure nightmares. The boys and the Indians, and the tired mom, and new Money Ken and Barbie Parton were being given the chance to get lost in it all before the crowd filled the place in. The notion made John feel heavy. He barely noticed the ribbon cutting, but he couldn't help grimacing at Heidi's jaunty pose as he leaned on his prop scissors afterwards. The man twiddled his fingers in a mocking wave at John. Then, John was following the tide of children into a sprawling space of ragged wooden partitions and hay bales and twisting plastic trees. He hadn't expected the innards of the building to be quite so hectic or disorienting. The Indian family meandered through a rack of costumes and low-hanging jack-o'-lantern masks. Barbie and Trust Fund Ken and the zombies made a beeline for the back. The boys seemed to have adopted Tired Mom's kid into their midst. Lewis was their spokesman. "Dad, do you have to come with us?" Lewis gave a look back to the now 3 other boys and returned his gaze to John, pleading pitifully. No, I guess not. Just don't get kidnapped. Don't leave the store. Be back here in an hour."
You're so awesome, Mr. Carmichael.
John turned to Tired Mom. "That okay with you?"
Yeah, why not?"
She pointed a finger at her boy.
"Don't break anything, honey. Got it?"
The boy nodded. The rest jittered with excitement. Then, all at once, they were gone, following a wooden sign pointing to hell. Tired Mom strode a few steps and slapped the sign.
At least they're self-aware."
John hadn't anticipated laughing at all this day, but he did then. "Hey, I'm John. The blonde one's mine. The rest are just there to make things nice and, well, loud."
"Lynn, my son is George. He's the one who didn't come with you."
"Oh?" John chuckled. Lynn was pretty, not overly so, but there was something appealing about her smirk and the sharpness of her eyes. John sucked his gum into his front teeth and threw it back into his molars. Lynn was probably pretty enough to be a problem for John. He noted her hand. No ring. Divorced, he reckoned. The bit of trivia made him fiddle with his own gold band. "You think Heidi's Playhouse has a bar?" he asked. This time she smiled, gave John a once-over.
"Yeah, they just don't know it."
She reached in her purse, pulled out a hip flask, shook it.
"You think they let us smoke in here? This place is massive. Maybe they wouldn't even notice."
She rummaged and added a pack of Parliaments to her handful of booze. John knew he shouldn't, but he felt himself grinning all the same. "You are a very intelligent woman, Lynn."
"I know."
"Anything else fun in that bag?"
Hand lotion, chapsticks, condoms, a big brick of cocaine."
"Chapstick, huh?" She smiled more.
"Come on, let's find a couple stools, Mr. Carmichael."
Lynn was easy to talk to, and for the first time since setting out, John felt unexpectedly settled. The cigarette helped. Lynn might have helped more. She had been a small stage actress in Los Angeles once upon a time, a palm reader in Nevada, a hospital scribe in Louisville, a cigarette smuggler between Winston-Salem and New York City, a bartender in Galveston, and then a mom in Indiana. Now she worked in human resources, but she still had the air of a vagabond. John had less to say about himself. He confessed that he was trying to quit smoking as he tapped a nub of ash onto the floor. Lynn said that clearly he was doing a great job as she flicked a Zippo lighter closed and puffed. She toyed with the lighter after. Open, closed, open, closed.
"Has your son gotten into the pyro phase yet?"
John had tended to smoke in secret. Delilah didn't like the smell. "Nope. Is that a thing? Lewis is my first."
"Maybe. George steals lighters, or maybe I'm just not good at keeping track of them."
"Well, I let Lewis watch horror movies, and now he's obsessed." John drew on his cigarette. Maybe we're both, mediocre parents." Lynn chuckled.
"Maybe."
Their smoke drifted conspicuously and went unnoticed. They had found a place tucked back against a wall, half hidden by a shattered mirror and a mannequin with an oddly small head. It had a pair of thick, rusted chains in place of arms. Many of the dressings of the place were similar, a bit too creepy or bizarre for most children, and John wondered if Terry would come running back at some point, sniffling and asking to leave. Possibly. Could John convince the others that it was entirely Terry's idea? He rattled the chain absently and imagined looking helplessly compassionate, and his thoughts meandered. So did you see that Heidi guy's kid, the dog thing? Lynn took a bracing pull from the flask. You think that's his kid? Who else's would it be? Some families. I'm sure that kid's face is on a milk carton somewhere. She shook her cigarette pack. Another? I've only got a couple left, but you seem like you could use it, Quitter. Sure, thanks. John took the pack, opened the top. One of the cigarettes was flipped upside down. 2 left. You want to keep the lucky? Nah, you have it. You haven't made a pass at me. Maybe I'm lucky enough. Well, I planned on it, but I'd have to find a payphone and clear it with my wife first. John pictured Lynn without a top for a moment. Then he pictured his wife, Delilah, scowling reproachfully. But mentioning his wife made his flirtation feel more idle, less fraught. Lynn narrowed her eyes and pulled the unlucky cigarette from the pack. You're a weird guy, John Carmichael. Bad weird? Bleh. You needy men. She brought the cigarette to her lips, gave a self-satisfied grin. John was only slightly abashed. What, I'm asking for a friend. John's rebuttal made no sense, but Lynn played along, scoffing unconvincingly. Fine. Then, out of curiosity, how do you think your friend would make a pass at me? Purely to satisfy your curiosity? John's lip curled despite himself. She leaned forward a bit. Sure, satisfy me, Oh, what the fuck? She twisted toward the wall behind them, grimaced, and John saw it immediately. A portly man was waddling past them. John saw a pasty expanse of a bare chest and belly and legs, and cringed at the thought that the man might be entirely nude. It was difficult to say for certain. All of the man, apart from his feet, bound tightly in plastic wrap. His arms fixed fast against his sides, his legs immobilized, all of which together gave the man the look of a slightly anthropomorphic grubworm. A moment later, he tripped and fell hard onto his belly. Jesus Christ, you think that guy works here? John asked. The man began to squirm across the floor, a new muffled moan escaping him with each crinkle and stretch of his body. Lynn eyed him, repulsed. I guess so. Fuck. Definitely not some character from Nickelodeon. Disney, maybe? John offered dryly. Her disgust betrayed a minuscule chuckle. John found it particularly adorable. Then he felt like secluding themselves was becoming a bad idea. Their flirting had all come too easily. Something harmless might not stay that way. He pocketed the Parliament pack she'd given him and watched the last of the cellophane creep slide from view. He had left a trail of something wet behind, Lynn noticed. Ew, if that's piss. She tucked her cigarette into her shirt and took another hard swig from the flask. Fortunately, Lynn, we are never going to find out. John rose to his feet and offered a hand. Time to fuck off? Yes, please. She took the hand graciously. He checked his watch. It had been 40 minutes and the boys were somewhere, and John was feeling more unsure than ever about Heidi's Playhouse. The store was a place for getting lost. It wound chaotically in cramped aisles, overhung with bunches of plastic witch cauldrons, gathered like fat black grapes, crowded with wisps of fake cobweb, clogged with styrofoam tombstones. The costumes caught drafts of air, shivering now and then on their racks or poles or hooks. Princess dresses and biohazard suits, polyester gorilla hides and spiderish latex monstrosities. John and Lynn trudged, squeezed through stacks of barrels and around nonsensical monoliths of corrugated steel. Sometimes they would share a chuckle or groan at something camp. Sometimes they would rage at a meandering aisle that terminated with nothing but a lone rocking chair, or the greasy mouth of a crawl space. The aisle partitions grew higher the deeper they went, and the lights flickered, stuttering arrhythmias that perpetually seemed to threaten to plunge into darkness. An hour passed by on John's watch, and he and Lynn hadn't seen anyone apart from the man wrapped in plastic. Even so, he couldn't help but feeling that they were being watched. "Lewis? Time to go, buddy." When Lynn called George, the name echoed. "George, George, George." Then it warped, modulating into a muddy "George." Apparently they were being recorded, and as John looked around for the speaker playing back Lynn's voice, he heard a quiet, "How do you think your friend would make a pass at me? Make a pass at me? Make a pass at me?" Lynn flushed, embarrassed, then angry. "Oh, what the fuck, Heidi? Seriously?" Her shrillness was met with silence, a thing she remedied by kicking over a plastic tub of devilish-looking children's pitchforks. She looked to be on the verge of saying something, or perhaps screaming, for around a minute, but there was no one nearby to berate, no one to apologize, no one to snigger and make a target of themselves. John said nothing. His search for speakers had shifted upwards to the high ceiling, as he now tried to get his bearings. In his distraction, he stumbled over something. The legs of an immense rubber horse strewn across the walkway. His hands landed in something wet as he fell forward. More of the horse. Its fake belly yawned open to a carpet of slick, swollen viscera that spread out over their path. It reeked of chemicals. John growled as he found his feet. "Christ, what is the point of this fucking thing?" A greasy sort of gel clung to John's legs, his sleeves. Lynn shook her head. "What's the point of any of it? It's that Heidi guy's fucked up art project." She clutched her purse against her ribs and carefully skirted the horse. "Let's just find George and your kids and get out of this place." John's eyes returned to the ceiling as he grumbled his assent and wiped at his trousers. This wasn't a place for children. They'd be lucky to escape without needing a tetanus shot. And John hadn't seen it because he'd been too eager to get away from the annoyance of spectacle or parenting or both. The boys, of course, would be blissfully unaffected. There were 4 of them, and if George was anything like Lewis, the 2 would nudge each other and the rest into acting brave. They'd dare one another to go deeper, willfully oblivious to the wrongness of everything. John had cajoled his boy into being that way. A fearless idiot. There were times when he was proud of that, now it made him uneasy. As John and Lynn walked silently, his gaze continued to drift upwards. There was a distinct appearance of unsoundness to the construction of the roof that John also hadn't noticed at first. Wood and metal spliced crudely together in sagging joints, slapdash bundles of cables and chains held leaning lighting fixtures aloft. He squinted at a shape moving in the distant ceiling rafters. A man, maybe. Crawling, then standing, then... If John had blinked, he might have missed it and been better off. The man would have just been another decoration then, obscured by the rest, but as he fell from the rafter, a long rope he had been cradling caught him by the neck. Now he swayed gently, limply at the rope's end, drifting in and out of view behind a nearby stack of half-melted tires. John felt fucking ill. "Did you see that, Lynn?" "See what?" That guy just... He just hanged himself, I swear, The man had swung out of view and didn't swing back. John could still see the rope. "What guy?" He stared, searching for movement. "No, nothing. Never mind. It doesn't matter. Let's just find the kids." Again, he shouted Lewis's name, and as if responding to the sound, a large section of nearby fluorescence went dark. He yelled for anyone next. No answer. The silence felt heavy. It rippled into occasional shuffles or creaks or vaguely human sounds, skittering footsteps, a cleared throat, a giddy collection of breaths. Then the silence would fill what sound displaced it. Waiting and listening became a burden. "There's a basement to this place," John said as he watched the lights flicker out, pause, and return. "Heidi mentioned it when he was being a dick outside. They might have gone there." "Why the fuck would there be a basement?" "No, you know what? Of course there's a basement. Fucking fuck!" Lynn shook her head incredulously, chuckled humorlessly. John didn't know if he had it in him to be even that animated. a bit of unicorn fluid sloshed inside his shoe. It made a sound as he walked, a wet, rainy day sound. The piece of nicotine gum he dragged from his pocket made a sound that was fairly similar as he began to chew, but it made him feel even less tired, more acute. He glimpsed another movement in the rafters, another person. He was sick of looking upward, so he looked straight ahead or at Lynn instead. She really was pretty. So, what's the story with George's dad? Lynn scoffed. We best friends now or something? Drinking buddies, at least. I'm trying to distract you, and me. Don't be a dick about it.
Aw, how gallant of you, John. But okay, he's a deadbeat piece of shit. He left.
She cinched her lips.
That's all. Seen any good movies lately?
Groundhog Day?
No, I've seen that one. Okay, what day would you least like to repeat forever? And this one doesn't count.
She pointed, smirking, at a mannequin made up to look like Bela Lugosi and Dracula as they rounded a corner.
Oh, come on. The timing on that was perfect.
John forced a smile that felt real enough a second later. Then he thought about her question and his frown returned. The day my wife was packing her bags, I guess. We'd been fighting stupid stuff that got blown up. I had a problem with my medication, and she was dealing with her own shit, and keeping my problems to myself was making me mean. Louis was 7 then, 4 years ago. He had a habit of climbing up onto the roof out of his window, and this time he slipped, fell. Delilah and I were halfway into a shouting match. We didn't hear him crying at first, and to this day I don't know how long he was down there on the ground. He ended up okay, obviously, but we didn't know that for a while, and the whole time we were in the hospital I kept thinking that he was up there trying to get away from us, from something I probably started, that it was my fault. Lynn had lagged behind then, and when John turned, she was staring at him.
Jesus, John.
You asked.
Yeah, but I expected the day I ran over that drifter. Yours is, Jesus, sorry, guy.
John had overshared. Too honest. He needed to be better at distracting. Less dour. He swallowed his story, kept his frown. Well, that drifter had it coming, Lynn, but thanks. Her momentarily befuddled look made it hard for John to keep a straight face. The look was funny. She was funny. And she was quick. It didn't take her long to blow a raspberry and roll her eyes.
I bet he did.
So what about you? Worst day, best day? Ever met Bill Murray? She walked a few steps toward him, stopped.
My worst day was when I was living as a drifter, you see. I'd been walking down this deserted street when...
Bill Murray in a Cadillac?
An Oldsmobile.
A man of the people. I told him to hit you, you know.
I know. Bastard.
John watched her, watching him, wanting to kiss her, but he didn't try. He had a feeling she would have gone along with it, but then what? She was unexpected, fun, a better distraction than he could hope to be. And he was weary. His marriage was still a difficult one, but the indulgence would be frivolous and then he'd feel worse for it. He huffed and pummeled his gum and winced away the thought of doing something fun and stupid. She seemed to recognize his turmoil, such that it was. She said she'd been a palm reader once. Perhaps she was good at reading people. Better than John was at concealing himself. And maybe she wanted him to kiss her, too. She sighed woefully, squinted down the corridor and into the dim distance for a while. Uncertainty crept into her face.
You ever hear of H.H. Holmes, John?
The porn star? She chuckled.
Not quite. He was a serial killer in Chicago 100 years ago. A doctor. He built a hotel with trapdoors and weird winding hallways. And he killed his guests. Dissected them in the basement. They came for the World's Fair and they never went home.
Her forehead wrinkled.
I wonder if they walked around that hotel getting lost and thinking that it was just a weird place instead of a dangerous one.
Her eyes flitted around them. John felt it too. The dread of too much pomp followed by too much silence. The crowd outside still hadn't entered Heidi's Playhouse. John and Lynn would have heard them. Why keep them waiting? I don't think that Heidi's trying to kill us, John comforted. Yeah, I know. This place just seems off, doesn't it? Sorry, thinking too much. Well, think of something distracting. You seem to be pretty good at that, right? Bill Murray's Oldsmobile. What color was it? Blue? John sighed theatrically. Good, we'll probably get away with it then. Lynn smiled tepidly, called George's name, took John's hand. I died, remember? You and Bill killed me. This is a haunting. He straightened his fingers in the grip of her hand, and he let them curl. He could give in to that much as they walked. A distracting comfort. In the silence, John worried about his son, about all the boys. He called Lewis's name again and again, and no one answered. That silence stalked them, more insidious than any fake gore or looming plastic monster. The silence was their monster. No child shrieks or cackles in the distance. Nothing but uncertainty. Lewis would have answered John if he could hear him. One of the boys would have. And John began to sweat. He chewed his gum. He thought of the man falling from the rafters, and the silence grew more bold. Help me! Somebody! He's gonna kill me! The silence broke with a man's voice. John and Lynn halted. The voice was close. Please, anybody! Closer still. Breathy. Then its source came bolting around a corner. The father from the Indian family. He was 60 feet from John and Lynn, 40 feet, when a shirtless man in a devil mask rounded the corner after him, 35 feet when he stumbled and fell. The devil was upon him a moment later, raising a knife, stabbing. The man screamed, and John's feet found bravery or foolishness or both. He hurtled towards the devil. Wait, you... The devil began to speak just before John tackled him off. The knife was lost in the impact. John raised a fist. Wait, it's not real! The devil cowered, and John heaved. What? The knife is just plastic. We were just trying to scare you. Behind John, the Indian father was rising. It wasn't real. And John had almost fed the devil his teeth. Christ, sorry, buddy, I thought... He helped the guy to his feet. He was in the line outside. I didn't think that... The devil chuckled. No harm done, man. Dileepa here and I were just palling around. The father, Dileep, stood shakily. You aren't hurt, are you, Dileep? Dileep had a tidy, respectable look. Round glasses, soft, almost mournful eyes. A sweater and pressed khaki pants. His wife had worn a sari. Something pretty. They were the sort of couple you'd trust to hold your wallet while you jumped in a pool. The devil had a nipple piercing. No, I'm not hurt, Dileep conceded. There, see? So, big man, little lady, were you scared? A little, yeah, Lynn answered. Sure, John added. Great performance, both of you, but we're looking for our kids, 4 of them. Any help finding them? The devil wrapped his arm around Dileep. The two made an awkward pair. Dileep was stiff, the devil gregarious, as he told John and Lynn that the boys could possibly be in the basement. Though who fucking knows with kids. He leaned on Dileep as he picked the bottom of his shoe. Dileep stared blankly ahead. John could hear the smile in the devil's face. There were stairs here and there, he explained, but probably the easiest and closest way to get down was a freight elevator in the back of the store. Once you're down there, the blood baby will help you find your kids, he said as though it were perfectly normal. Blood baby? Lynn asked. Another chuckle. You'll see. Have fun, you two. When they were gone, Lynn stared at John, bewildered. Those two were palling around? Not a clue. Surprised you rushed that guy. Me too, actually. I could probably find you a superhero costume somewhere. Oh, yeah? I could use a new one. She shook her head and smirked. For the next 10 minutes or so, she mused about what his superhero name would be. John felt lighter, having finally run into a mostly sane employee. One who didn't wriggle. Lewis was fine. John had a direction, and they walked. The knot of costume aisles eventually gave way to the monotony of hay bales, bound in nylon cord and stacked to the ceiling. Then the ceiling was hay too, and John stooped to walk as errant stalks snatched at Lynn's hair. The path wound left, right, doubling back. The bales didn't budge, and John's ankles felt itchy. Their only light flickered from time to time, like all the rest in Heidi's Playhouse. Bundles of orange Christmas lights, an occasional bare bulb sprouting from above. It reminded John of a farm fair he had gone to with his wife and son when Louis was too young to walk. There had been a man that day who had chatted with Delilah while John was buying candy apples. He watched the man brush his fingers through Delilah's hair, grinning. He watched Delilah smile politely as she pulled away. He watched the man's face sour as she left him standing alone. Then the man had been there in the straw maze, waiting. He hadn't seen John with her at first, and from that point on, John would see him watching her from a distance. This place was different. John reminded himself of that. Still, he lamented the shrinking roof, the narrowing sides. Lynn crouched like John, then both of them crawled. Thrilling for a child, perhaps, but an aching annoyance for an adult. It didn't persist for long, though. The tunnel ended at a miniature door, proportioned like any panel door in a house with 3 small hinges and a tiny doorknob. But it couldn't have been more than 3 feet tall. John crawled. He swallowed as he turned the knob. He inhaled as he pushed. "What the hell?" was all he could think to say. The door opened into a mock town square that looked every bit like a movie set. The wooden facades of buildings rose upward, most freckled haphazardly with dozens or hundreds of tiny windows. John was still on his knees when he noticed the first familiar person he'd seen in nearly 2 hours. Shep, the dog-faced boy, faced away, peering into one of the houses. "Hey, kid." Shep turned for a split second, and then darted into a rather grand-looking brick house as John finally rose to his feet. Lynn followed him out, gawked. "What the hell is this?" "Yeah. Look, I saw that dog kid, Shep, go into that building." John pointed. "I'm guessing Heidi's not far off." Lynn brushed straw from her pants, looked around them. "Oh, I'm guessing you're right." She gestured upwards towards the mock sky above. Dark cloth, Christmas light stars, cobweb clouds, the moon, a giant glowing eye. John watched as the eye swiveled slightly. A shutter slid closed around it, a blink. When it opened again, it was just a moon. John made an effort to avoid looking at the thing. The creaking floor made for enough of a distraction. The planks sagged. Every building around them was constructed with a slight tilt. Even the fussy-looking house that Shep had entered seemed to labor under the oddity of its own construction. "Well, let's follow Shep," John said. "A tiny mansion in a fake town seems fitting for a pimp like Heidi." Lynn giggled. "After you." The grand house into which Shep had disappeared had a miniature colonnade along its front and a wide portico overhead. John was first to enter, and once again was unnerved by what he saw. There was a chintzy sitting room steeped in the scent of stale cigarette smoke. A number of dolls sat around the space, positioned to look natural, which made them look anything but. Each of them were hollow-eyed and pale-faced, weathered porcelain and frumpy antique clothes. A single cigarette sat burning in an overflowing ashtray beside a doll whose face was turned towards the door. Lynn groaned miserably. John traced the walls and low ceilings, unable to restrain a sneer. Every here and there, sprouting grotesquely from the cracked plaster, were drooping bunches of long black hair. They fell limply from the walls and from the ceiling, gathering in pools or swaying, just barely grazing the floor. Somewhere nearby, a child whimpered. "Louis? George?" Lynn jogged to the adjacent room and stopped dead in the doorway. What the fuck is... What are you doing here?" John hurried to her side, peered over her shoulder. He had to hunch to see through the door. The boys weren't there, but Barbie Parton was, and her 3 children. All of them sat around a squat dining table in little chairs. Each looked sickly in their own distinctive ways. The youngest child, a girl, whined and pushed a piece of meat around her tiny plate. The middle boy was plastered in what John thought was vomit. The eldest boy's chin was red, his shirt too. His eyes met John's for a moment, pleaded, then returned to the table and its miniature candelabras and the pile of meat at its center. The meat looked real. The blood looked real. "Hey, we're looking for our kids. 4 boys, have you..." The eldest raised a shaking finger to his lips, then pointed at the wall. More red. Words. Finger-painted in swooping letters. "Keep quiet. Keep eating." John noticed a camera on the wall. Lynn looked in that direction with him, then to the table, then whispered,
John? Where's the dad?
The middle boy, who was closest to the door, fidgeted. John saw the black stain of mascara on Barbie's cheeks. This wasn't a distant hanging or a concocted stabbing. The meat looked real. Was real. Where was the dad? John felt sick. "You all need to get up and come with us, okay?" The girl choked out a sob. The eldest boy hissed an imploring, "Shh!" He winced at the camera, bit into a forkful of meat, retched. Lynn had begun to breathe heavily.
John? What is this?
"I don't know.
Why won't they move?
I don't know.
Where's their father, John?
I don't..." John looked at the camera. An ever-watchful eye. Heidi.
We have to do something, John.
Lynn was right. He went to the little girl. Maybe they wouldn't move, but John could move them. "Come on, sweetie." He grabbed her chair. Barbie shook her head frantically. He pulled. The chair moaned. The girl shrieked.
John, fuck her legs!
Lynn shouted. The table was low. The chairs were low. The tablecloth hung low, obscured. John hadn't seen the tangle of barbed wire underneath. Now the girl was sobbing, bleeding, and the oldest boy took another frantic bite of meat. And then another.
John? What do we do?
He wanted to give Lynn an answer, but as he stooped to look beneath the table, he saw bolts and brackets and padlocks. He had no tools, and he wasn't going to free any of them with his bare hands. He could only make them bleed more. We'll come back for them, yeah? Everything's gonna be okay." Lynn didn't respond. She sucked breaths through her teeth. John's mind ambled uselessly. The blood was real. The danger was real. His child was missing. He shied from the girl's face, from any of their faces. Mother and daughter racked with tears, an ashen middle child, the eldest trying sickeningly to abide by the silent dictate of the room, the bloody words upon the wall. Whatever they had witnessed was a thing beyond the comfort of 2 aspiring saviors. They were alone, hostages to a camera, and they obeyed their instructions. It made John's skin crawl. Then, out of aimless, grim curiosity, he was stumbling weakly into the next room, into a kitchen with counters and cutting boards and brimming buckets. He retched, shut his eyes as he returned to the dining room beyond nauseated. "What's in there?" Lynn asked. Nothing, okay? We'll go get help as soon as we can." They left the family behind. John defeated by what he'd tried and what he'd seen. Lynn lucky to have not been curious. There had been a small hole in the wall of the kitchen near the floor. Too small for John. Shep had vanished into it, no doubt. There was nowhere else for the boy to have gone. And as sick as John felt, he found himself wandering over to the window Shep had been looking into when he first saw him. It might be nothing, or it might be something horrible, John didn't know, but he needed to see, and... "Benny?" John's gut fluttered. The boy looked up at the sound of John's voice and then flattened back into a small mattress on the floor. John turned to Lynn. "One of the boys. George? No, I don't see him. That doesn't mean he's not close." Lynn winced, nodded, started checking windows. John went inside. Benny barely stirred. "Benny, buddy, get up. Where are your clothes?" John shook him. There was no blood, no obvious wounds, apart from a couple of bruises. "Benny?" The boy was in his underwear, sprawled, murmuring indistinctly. John searched for shoes, pants, anything. But the room was dimly lit, filthy with shadows, and the only thing John could find beyond Benny was the mattress and a bit of rubber, a spoon, and an empty syringe. John's muscles tightened. His breath caught. Then he tried to breathe the vignette away. There was no bag of brown powder. John hated himself for noticing that. He lifted Benny's head from the mattress, felt the drool clinging to the side of his face. His breathing was shallow. But he was breathing, and as John pulled him into his arms, as he wrapped him in his jacket, the boy smiled like any child might, midway through a dream. "Benny, it's Mr. Carmichael, Lewis's dad." The boy nodded dozily. "Where are the others, Benny?" "My son. Terry. George."
"Yeah, George won't find them. He will, though."
"He? Benny, what happened? Where's Lewis?" The building groaned for Benny as his brow furrowed.
"Can you sleep a little longer? I don't want to play the prickle game anymore."
"Benny, where is Lewis?" His eyes fluttered. He didn't open them.
"Down. Hell."
John had seen a sign pointing to hell near the entrance of the store. Down? The basement? John carried Benny out into the square. Lynn had been busy calling George's name. Now she was silent, standing before a building with a leaning cross above the door. "What?" He paced toward her. Her face was pallid, awash in some new horror. Wood creaked. Lynn shook.
"John, don't."
There was a crack. A thunderous lurch, and the floor beneath them sunk. And then, it wasn't there at all.
"John, are you okay?" "What?"
His thoughts twisted dizzily, forming and bleeding away, cast around in hollow, myopic gusts. In his leg, a swollen ache slithered along the back of his knee, licking the back of his thigh in numb muscles. His back was sore. Where was Benny? He searched, caught up in some blind, singular focus. He found the boy quickly, sprawled across a beam, bleeding only a little. Lynn looked morose, covered in gray-brown dust, cradling her arm, wincing as she spoke.
"John, we need to move."
Yes. She strained at a pile of wood that lay across John's lower half. She was pretty even now. The sound of pained timbers brought John back to his senses. A flurry of sparks leapt from a fractured conduit line above. Bright flashes swallowed by the murk of the air. Finally, Lynn wrenched the wood free. A slab of flooring. She paled.
"Shit. It's not as bad as it looks."
It looked bad enough. A 6-inch long shard of wood jutted from John's calf. He could only feel the fringes of it. The endorphins would last a while. Pain would come eventually. But in this moment he could move, and above him the ceiling listed, leaning in, almost as if to listen for the screams it would bring, should it become too curious. A single beam stood nearby, quietly waiting to falter. Above it was the grand house, brick and plaster and death if John didn't... "Move, John, now!" Lynn yanked at him. He scuttled along the debris, limped when he was clear of the worst of it. Lynn dragged Benny along, into a corridor where John could brace against the walls. He hobbled. Lynn did her best with Benny. The three of them inched forward. They moved, tired. The lone beam made an awful, bestial howl as it gave way. The sound of collapse stampeded down the corridor. There were no screams after. And John thought of two words written indelibly in blood. Keep quiet. Step brace, pain, step. John tried not to make a sound. Each and every time the piece of wood wiggled and his leg rioted. The crutch he and Lynn had managed was unwieldy. A broken 2x4 with a bolt where John could rest the heel of his hand. They'd spent more time on the sledge for Benny. John's jacket, electrical cable, 2 broken lengths of PVC pipe. Whatever water the pipe was meant to carry didn't flow. A sewage line, a sprinkler system. John couldn't be certain. The family they'd left to die, if they weren't dead already. Their bellies full of flesh. The poor girl's legs tattered. Perhaps they'd all died quickly and were better for it. No one came running, no dutiful stock boy or sweating manager, and the family lay behind a rubble heap of masonry and lumber. They were beyond the help of a scared mother and a cripple and a strung-out child, so the 3 survivors trudged and survived and said nothing. If the basement was the hell the sign had pointed to when they first entered, it was aptly named. It was full of sounds, drips, splatters, retches, wet anatomical squelches, rolling thumps, heavy moaning breaths, skittering feet, the whine of metal, the creak of wood, giggles, whispers, screams. Speakers, John assumed, though he saw none. Above their heads, red lights throbbed, slowly dimming to nothing, then returning bright as dusk. In that flood of red, everything looked dark, the shadows blacker, the glisten of wet on the walls more ominous. The ceiling hung low, ribbed with wide wood beams that splintered at the edges, and John couldn't be certain, but he thought he heard the sound of happy squeals and the patter of feet somewhere up and away. The family's outside. John hoped he was wrong about that. He tried to focus on forward. Somewhere he'd find his son. He'd find a way out. A staircase, a freight elevator, a door that led to light. He and Lynn chose their turns in the maze of corridors in a way that kept to a single broad direction, traversing arteries that opened suddenly into gaping, vacant atria. Little rooms and big, open doors and locked ones. If the upper floor was one for getting lost, the basement was one for never finding a way out. "How the fuck are you supposed to navigate this place?" Lynn asked. "Everything looks the same." "I don't know. We just keep walking." She frowned. "That family, do you think they're dead?" "Lynn, don't think about it. There's nothing we can do for them right now, is there?" John heard a child's laugh above, distinctly this time, a parent's barked admonition. Lynn looked forward, heaved at the sledge, grunted. It was easy enough for John to carry Benny before. Lynn had tried. John cursed his leg. It had made him a burden. Finally, he said, "They could be alive. We can hope they are." Maybe his words helped. Maybe not. Others might. A distraction. "Hey, tell me about George. What kind of kid is he?" "What?" She adjusted the cord slung over her shoulder. "I don't know. He's a kid. He likes horror movies and video games." "Oh, yeah?" John managed to chuckle. "Nintendo or Sega?" "Nintendo. His dad is a little too devil-may-care, though. George gets nightmares sometimes." Does George see him on holidays or something? You said he'd left. I assumed you were divorced." Look. George is great. His dad isn't." She smirked. "I didn't know you were giving so much thought to my marital—" A screech of feedback cut Lynn off. Benny grimaced, mumbled something softly. A doleful piano melody followed, the sound of a creaking door. The voice of a pimp.
"Greetings to all you frightened families, chattering children, moaning mommies, dearly departed daddies. Let me be the first to say I'll miss you when you shriek yourselves to death. I'll mourn you, I really will. But fake bodies ain't cheap and ambiance is everything. To those of you who are good at staying alive, I've got good news. All costumes are 13% off until 6:66 p.m. So watch your watches, and remember, Heidi is always watching you."
Heidi's voice brought an unctuous spasm to John's jaw. He needed more gum. The cigarette in his jacket pocket, something stronger. The litany of spooky sounds had ebbed. Heidi's intercom had left more silence in its wake. and in the silence, John heard a whimper.
"Did you hear that?" "What?"
Lynn was rubbing her shoulder. "It sounded like... Wait, hello?" There was a quick whine. Lynn darted ahead, turned a corner out of sight. "John!" Lynn's cry, then, "No, leave me alone." A little voice. John saw his son. A reunion. Promised that he'd never leave him to wander in the dark again. He saw Lewis's tears. He saw Lynn's jealous half-smile. He saw the pain of his leg fading. He had hobbled and hoped beyond reason as he neared the corner. The voice wasn't his son's, but it was a child, and John was too beaten and broken to care. It was Lewis until it wasn't. Then it was the little girl upstairs again. The girl from the Indian family lay motionless, snared in another tangle of barbed wire, and John's hand shook on the bolt of his crutch, which now bore too much of his weight. He nearly toppled. Lynn looked back to John with a peculiar mix of anxiety and relief. John had fixated on the girl, on the stain of helplessness that seeped from a pile of quiet rubble. He didn't see the sign right away. The letters blended into the red. Exit. The barbed wire was a trap. The girl wasn't shackled to a thing. She'd been trying to get out. John could help her. He would help her. "Try not to move," he said. He tried to sound reassuring. The girl was crying. "We're going to get you out." "I won't go back," she thrashed. "We don't work here," Lynn added. "We're both looking for our kids. My friends are Lewis and Terry. Lewis is blonde. Terry is husky. We met your dad, I think, with a guy in a devil mask." "My dad's, they killed him. And the man leading us at first, he said he was there to help, but he lied. They all lied. They said they wouldn't kill anyone. They said to be good. We did everything, and they still killed them." Them. John's legs felt weak. Who else did they kill? "John, let's get her out of here first," Lynn said sharply. "Right, sorry." He lifted a strand of wire awkwardly. "What's your name, honey?" She sniffled. "Nyla." Nyla had tried to crawl through a gap in the wire and gotten stuck. It didn't take long to get her out. She hugged Lynn first, wept into her shoulder, then John. She was too small to go through whatever she'd been through. John didn't want to make her relive a second of it. He let her be for a while as she grieved. When Lynn went back for Benny and John and Nyla were alone, she stared at his leg and asked nothing about it. She must have known that something awful had happened. Another something. John slumped to the ground and sighed. "Nyla, I can't imagine what you've seen, but..." "The heavy kid was your son?" "No. My son Lewis is skinny. He has blonde curls." "When I left, the blonde one was still alive. He's lucky, I guess." "And the heavy kid?" Nyla shut her eyes and said nothing. John nodded. Terry was dead. He didn't ask if it was quick. "I'm so sorry about your dad. About everything, Nyla." The girl parted her lips for a moment as if she would say something. She didn't. She was quiet, leaning against John until Lynn returned. The mechanics of getting a girl safely over several feet of barbed wire seemed like a callous topic to discuss, while she still broke intermittently into wandering sobs. The sledge would do most of the work. John's jacket was thick. His crotch was sturdy. Lynn volunteered her jacket as well. Nyla had left hers at a place called The Tooth. It was near the big elevator, a thing she remarked upon with a twinge of sorrow. When John asked her if she would take Benny with her, she seemed uncertain. She relented eventually on her own. John was going to stay, something he proclaimed resolutely as the girl once again eyed his leg. No one argued. In the end, Lynn hugged the girl for a long while. She whispered something in her ear. A distraction. A motherly comfort. Nyla moved quickly over the wire afterward. Lynn helped with Benny. And as Nyla stood waiting, she looked harrowed and she looked safe. Beyond the door, there was a flight of stairs and there was light. John had gotten into a rhythm of leaning on his good foot, and then his crutch. He had to swing his bad leg inward as he threw his body forward. The one time that the shard in his calf nudged the crutch was enough to make the awkward movement a necessity. He retched, buckled at the waist. He wouldn't do it again. The heel of his hand that braced against the wall was worn raw, a different pain that strangely made John feel invigorated rather than sickened. His fingers on that hand were sticky. He imagined the blood was Heidi's and his rhythm grew more mechanical. His last piece of gum had lost its flavor near the exit door in the stairway, as he and Lynn pretended at a plan. John wanted his son. He'd find a way. All he needed to do was get his hands on Heidi and the pimp would do what he wanted. His fist enveloped the bolt, smothered it, and he hobbled on. Lynn occasionally jogged ahead, peering around corners the way a play-stalking cat might. She waited patiently for John. He hobbled faster until he couldn't. "I need a rest, Lynn. A short one." "How's your leg?" "Fine," he lied. "Well, I could use a smoke." "One left, you too." John had taken the Parliament pack and left the jacket with Benny. The lucky cigarette had gotten Benny out. Maybe it would work the same for John. "I'm saving mine." He settled onto the floor. "Unless you want it back." "No, we can share." She flipped open her lighter, puffed. The smoke rolled red in the light above. It looked like blood dispersing in the barrel of a syringe. "Here." She handed him the lighter. "Just remember to give it back when you don't need luck anymore." He took it. "Thank you." He meant more with those words than the gratitude of the moment. Lynn could have left him behind, but she didn't. She could have gone ahead, saved her son, and been done with the place. She was clever enough to figure it out. John heard a scream above them. His eyes roved the ceiling. Some cheap scare, something worse? Fear was fear, and he really couldn't tell. The thought brought another. Terry and his smiling face. Had he known in the end that the Playhouse wasn't just pretend? Did Lewis watch his friend die? And what about George? Nyla hadn't said a thing about him. John felt the sting of the cigarette ember on his fingers. He'd been thinking too much. "All right, Lynn. I'm good to go if you are." She stood and offered a hand. He took it graciously. A pile of fake corpses marked the start of a long corridor that led them into the nursery. That's what Lynn had called it. An easy name for an uneasy place. When John remarked on the skulls hanging from the ceilings on strings, Lynn's lip curled. He thought they must belong to turtles at first glance. The proportions were odd. Lynn was silent for a while before she corrected him. "They're infant skulls. I saw them in a museum once. Mummies." "Jesus." "Yeah." In the nursery, more hung from a mobile along with a half-dozen coldly drifting kitchen knives. The blades meandered, the skulls clicked softly, repulsively as they collided and parted with the mobile's procession round and round. Below, in the center of the room, was an immense crib. The bed sheets there were slick with the same blood that occasionally painted the walls or pooled along the edges of the floor. But the nursery was different from anywhere else they'd been. The other parts of the basement had been deserted, the first floor sparse. The nursery was brimming with people. Teddy bears and rabbits, a plush leopard, a bent-necked giraffe. A menagerie of adults dressed as stuffed animals crowded the room, and almost all of them stood huddled and weeping. The devil who had hung from Nyla's father and glad-handed John and Lynn had mentioned the blood baby. The nursery seemed a fitting place to find it. "Hello? We could use some..." As Lynn spoke, the sobs grew louder. "We could use some help." Her shout was swallowed by a chorus of wails. When she quieted, the din died away. "Fuck, what should we do?" she whispered. "Hey, our kids are missing. The building's collapsing, and one of my son's friends is dead." John boomed by the end, fighting against the screams of the animals. "What the fuck is wrong with you all?" None of them turned. They continued their theatrical grief, raging loud then simmering into the silence that followed. It reminded John of the family in the dining room. The mother hadn't said a thing, even when her daughter screamed. and dread settled heavily in his stomach. "Let's sit down a minute," John whispered. "In the hall. Away from whatever this is." He sat atop a rubber corpse, a woman in a tattered dress. The body wheezed under his weight. The face gawked up at him from the ground. Lynn paced. They spoke in whispers. "I don't like this, John." "I'm with you." "That devil who told us about the blood child or whatever, do you think he killed that little girl's dad?" "I don't know." "Fuck. I knew something was off here, but do you think we could have saved him?" The question stabbed at John. Yes, was the honest answer, but how could they have known? The man hadn't asked for help. If he was a hostage, it was by threat of a rubber knife. Something fake. John didn't imagine that he, like John, like Lynn and the other families upstairs, had been prodded by a silent threat. Be good or your family dies. Perhaps none of them could hide from Heidi. John answered finally. "We only could have pulled his chair, and he would have suffered because of it." Lynn folded down next to John, grabbed his hand in hers. This time he didn't hesitate in taking what comfort he could. He squeezed. She rested her head on his shoulder. For a minute or 10, John thought of nothing at all. Then he thought of Lynn's breath, the soft evenness of it, impossible to hear beneath the rattle of sobs. John hadn't noticed the sudden quiet of the nursery, and as he looked over to the doorway, he shuddered. They were gathered there, all of them watching Lynn and watching John. "Christ!" Lynn saw them. Her voice trembled. "John? One of you, we need help, please." Two teddy bears and an animal John didn't recognize stood silently in the doorway. Others stood behind. The giraffe's neck, the leopard's spots. One of the bears tilted its head. Unnerving. "This isn't an act. Children, real children, are dead. You see my leg? Real blood, real." At once, the animal swiveled, returned to the nursery. What was this? Lynn helped John to his feet. He stepped forward, tremulous. Lynn beside him. Could they not hear him? Another step. What kind of people? "I'm hoping for a boy. Christine wants a girl." One of the animals spoke. Not to John or Lynn. He chuckled dryly. "I feel like I'm drifting between diaper changes. 3 hours of sleep and then..." Another voice. "As long as she's healthy." "I'm buying a gun, a Ruger, to protect my family." "I bought a new chainsaw." John listened to different voices prattle on. Disjointed pieces of conversation. "Christine doesn't fuck me anymore." "I have a secret. I have a confession." "My wife is expecting. Any recommendations on a safe, reliable coffin?" John felt unease rising. An orchestrated thing. Rehearsed. "He's here," another voice whispered. Simultaneously, or nearly enough, the animals dropped to the floor. John was close enough to see most of the room. The skeletal crib. The slithering silhouettes of knives and tiny skulls. The sprawl of stuffies. The cracked door at the other end of the room, the face peering in. "Mama liked to sip the needle. Dada sipped the barrel of a gun. They both liked shooting. I wonder why they never quite liked me." A man's voice slipped from the cracked door, reedy and full of sluggish Dixie twang. When he opened the door, John saw a hunched, taut-muscled frame and a cloth diaper pinned at his hip. A bulbous mask, cherubic, grotesque with its dripping lacquer of blood. The man ambled deftly on 4 limbs, vaulted the rail of his crib gracefully, eased his mask between the bars. Everything considered, the man might have been a dancer. Maybe he was. "You wouldn't happen to have any milk, would you?" he asked lightly. "What?" Lynn cowered in the doorway, shoulder to shoulder with John. "Milk. Mama doesn't feed me any." He stopped as John thumped into the room. "Oh, jeez, what
What the heck happened to you? The southernness of his voice remained, but his creepy affect dropped. John stared at the man, uncertain. I fell. There was a collapse near the town upstairs. The floor caved in. Wait. You serious? Yes. Dang it. I know I told him there was too much wiggle in the floors, but you're okay though, right? I mean, generally? No, Lynn interrupted. We're not okay. We're missing our children. We haven't seen them in hours. Another child with us was drugged. We rescued a girl from a patch of barbed wire. She said her dad had been killed and a child that came in with them. What? Here. If this is some kind of gag. Does this look like a gag? John turned his leg. The piece of wood was steeped in blood. The unnaturalness of it was plain to see. We need help, a phone, the police, and we want our children. The blood baby, John assumed, muttered a string of fricks to himself. Hello? Lynn barked impatiently. Yeah, shoot, sorry. Of course, I'll get the owner on the radio. Heidi? John asked. Heidi? No. The baby snorted. He's just an actor, a mascot, basically. A creepy guy, but... Wait, did he do any of this? John wanted to say yes, but he wasn't certain. He had assumed the pimp was in charge of the Playhouse. The baby rooted beneath his bedclothes, found a walkie-talkie. Hey, folks, look, I need you to know that what happened to your leg, the thing with the girl and the barbed wire, none of that was supposed to happen. He tapped his mask on the crib rail. Heidi was big on treading that line where you don't really know if you're safe or not. He said anything less was for, pardon my language, milk-toothed pussies. He helped with some of the ideas, the red lights, the sounds. But obviously it's supposed to be pretend. No one agreed on anyone getting hurt. He drew in a long breath. The walkie-talkie scratched. This is Blood Baby at the nursery. We got a doozy of a problem. If the boss could call me on channel 1, that'd be swell. Over. They waited. John hobbled toward the crib. Lynn kept close. The animals on the floor didn't move. The blood baby resumed his tapping, banging his head the way Lewis sometimes did when he was overwrought. The mask was developing a dent. John had wanted to say a dozen vicious things to the guy. The words swelled on his tongue. But this guy wasn't the problem, so John settled on. Hey, thanks. For what? For being okay. He felt Lynn's hand on his shoulder. Hey, John? Do you smell that? She asked. What? She searched the room with her eyes. Smoke. John sniffed. He smelled it too. A fire somewhere. He turned back to the baby. How close are we to the freight elevator? The baby stopped tapping. You know what I admire most about Dr. Holmes? He knew how to make a buck from blood. He was a bona fide entrepreneur, a people person. A gosh dang visionary. I don't know who that is. John sniffed again. Smoke and something else, something vexing. Cheap cologne that almost smelled like... You must be bad at listening. The baby pressed his mask against the bars. The man stared through his eye holes. Well, I'm not. Daddy? John straightened up, stared at the man in the crib. Heidi. John didn't have time to do a thing, to think a thing. He was standing, and at his leg was mean electric pain and nothing else. He howled, looked down, saw an animal wrenching at the piece of wood in his calf. A dog he hadn't noticed among the rest. Shep. John toppled and Lynn shrieked. The animals were rising to their feet, grabbing, pulling. There were too many. There had always been too many. Now one of them wrestled John onto his belly. John threw an elbow wildly, weakly. His shoulder jerked as something twisted the wood, and the pain paraded up his side, sprouting haphazardly in his jaw and his upper back. He couldn't do a thing. As another body fell on top of his arm and a foot struck him in the ribs, as a pair of furry hands lifted his head back and made him watch,
as a rabbit and a horse pinned Lynn to the ground. As she screamed for John as they lifted her shirt, John was helpless, acutely aware of every odd-angled agony in his leg, dull where it mattered. He seethed as Heidi vaulted the crib rail once more, as he slinked spiderishly towards Lynn, as he lowered the pursed lips of his mask to her nipple. She raged and they held her fast, and Heidi said, "Nighty-night, Daddy." The first kick rattled his head. He couldn't do a thing. The second kick he saw coming, the leopard's foot rearing back, and then... everything was wrong. The stench of gasoline, of smoke, the distant screams, the caterwauling thrum of his head, the fits of raw, ungodly misery that ran through his leg, the memories. He wished he were dead. When he opened his eyes, he could only see through one. Part of his vision on the left side was no more than a dark smudge, a detached retina, perhaps. He cursed the half of his vision that remained clear. The first thing he saw was Heidi. Heidi standing beside a long, angular fang that hung from the ceiling. A steeple, John realized. He tried to remember the steeple that had risen up from the church that once stood where Heidi's playhouse now sprawled. Was this the same one? The steeple swayed, its cross almost touching the ground, the chains that held it aloft clinking serenely above. This room seemed cavernous, though John was unsure where it was. The basement, the first floor, or somewhere else entirely, he didn't know. But this room was bright, jarringly lit by a dozen or 24 beating, even fluorescent lights. John couldn't see them, but he heard the buzz. Heidi was busy chatting with a familiar small dog with moppish fur. The dog's dopey mask lay on a table a few feet away. John winked his bad eye closed to better see his face. Shep grinned, then laughed, then stroked the stubble on his cheek. Shep wasn't a boy. He was a dwarf. Heidi nudged the steeple with his back as he spoke. It jostled. The chains rattled. I know, he chuckled. But she's watching him down there, gasping himself to death, thinking that either her snatch is poison, or the guy really is allergic to her big St. Bernard's fur. Turns out he's just really, really allergic to peanut butter. Shep doubled over, and John remembered the man humping Benny. Benny struggling, red-faced. John hadn't stopped it. When he thought of the room where he'd found Benny, the missing clothes, the mattress, he felt ill. Hey, look, he's awake. Heidi turned his monstrous eyeball towards John. He was back in his red suit. Oh my gosh, he is. He mimicked the accent he'd used as the blood baby. How had John not noticed? Well, welcome back, Daddy. I hope you're comfy. I got a lot of fun planned, and I worried that you were too comfy. But you are comfy, aren't you? John was sitting in a wheelchair, immobilized. When he shifted or breathed too deeply, the barbed wire bit into his skin. Where's my son? Heidi gave the steeple a definitive bump. Straight to the point. All right, fine. But first, let's go trick-or-treating, Daddy. Fat little Terry said you've taken him. It made me jealous. Give me my son. Heidi shook his eyeball. I will. Scout's honor. He pushed John along, around an accordion partition. The wheels of the chair squeaked, wobbled. As they entered the adjacent section of the room, John pulled against the wires. They held, gnawed. Whatever horrors he had seen in meandering Heidi's constructed nightmare seemed paltry next to the simple scene before him. A body lay haphazardly near a long table stacked with yellow-spouted demijohns. A pale brown body, skinny and still. Nyla's brother. John didn't remember much of the boy, apart from him padding quietly after his parents. Now he was dead. A child discarded. The second body John saw may have been worse. On the edge of the room, he saw the wide, scissor-gated door of a manually operated elevator. The car sat vacant inside the shaft. At its base, its threshold where the car met flushly with the door, there was a dash of color, bright enough to draw John's attention. Both of his eyes welled, the one that could see and the one that couldn't. The color, turquoise and burgundy, flashes of gold, embroidery and copper, the fabric of a sari. With it were a pair of feet, legs, hips, and nothing more. Nyla's mother's body ended at the threshold. The rest of her body was gone, separated, hidden somewhere beneath the elevator car. When Nyla had mentioned the elevator, there was some forbearance that had played across her face. John hadn't understood then. He did now. Nyla had seen it happen.
You know, Daddy, all in all, I think this opening has been a wonderful success. Shep has gotten to play, always good for his morale, and I really think that people are scared. Don't you?
John could see the wide white curve of Heidi's mask pushing into his peripheral vision. He shook. Rage, grief, terror, they all seemed to blend together now.
Why?
Why are you doing this? John muttered. His gaze left the sari, found a line of folding chairs. 3 maskless animals sat playing a video game on one of a dozen television screens. They bickered, they ribbed and jeered. John couldn't see their faces. He wondered if they were smiling, heartlessly numb to everything they'd seen and done. When John had given a moment to imagine Heidi or whatever faceless monster watching that family eat, he had imagined a dark, cramped room, a single flickering screen. The reality was repulsively banal. A stockroom, a break room, a place for ordinary amusement and death. Heidi moved John toward a patchwork tarpaulin hiding something in the center of the room. He stopped a few feet from it. John's fingers curled atop his legs. I said, why are you...
Oh, I heard you, Daddy. But I will not rush my mise en scene. A proper reveal is everything in a good scare, you know?
He swiveled John an inch to the left.
There, perfection.
Heidi strode into view. He bowed. Shep sniggered.
You know, that's a terribly dull question, Johnny. Why am I doing this? I'm doing it because it's important. To me. Because it feels right. Like a cigarette after a long stay at a hospital or flirting with a pretty girl. You know? Have you ever taken a life, John?
John stared. He said nothing. Heidi tugged at the tarpaulin and sighed.
You know my favorite thing about Halloween? Other than hiding Shep's ugly face? It's the trust. The willful naivety. Nothing's real on Halloween, is it? The blood, the skeletons, the danger. The day arrives and what happens, John? Everyone believes that they're safe. A man dripping with blood, dragging an axe, comes to the door of someone's festive little suburban home. He lumbers up the stairs, rings the doorbell, and what does the daddy or mommy inside do? Oh, they get the bowl of candy and they unlock the deadbolt and they turn the knob. A place like this is no different. You know that the building is burning, don't you? Probably that hole you put in the floor. And upstairs, I bet there are a few people just lost in the aisles who still think it's pretend. You did, John. Until you shredded little Adelaide's legs. That was her name, you know. The first of my treats. The name you didn't ask for.
Heidi grabbed the tarpaulin and pulled. Louis. Oh, buddy, fuck, it's gonna be okay, alright? John bled from scores of tiny punctures as he thrust his body against the wires. Before him, 3 faces stared from the grip of a wide wooden stockade. Louis, Lynn, George. All were gagged uniformly with rags and duct tape, but each showed uniquely devastating facets of fear. Lynn was red-faced, eyes bent towards her son. George stared straight ahead, wide-eyed and glossy with sweat. Louis simply wept. None of them were in a position to see the large golden pair of novelty scissors that leaned against the stockade's frame. Let them go, please. Look, they're scared. I'm scared. That's what you want, right? You win. Whatever you want, please, just tell me what you want. John begged, offered more and more. He'd steal money from work. He'd give his car, his house, his life, anything. He'd confess to running the Playhouse. He'd go to prison, to the electric chair. He meant all of it. Heidi stood beside the stockade, watching blankly through his one impenetrable eye, slowly stroking the curve of the scissors handle. He didn't speak until John was spent. My God, John. Has anyone ever told you you are wildly persuasive when backed into a corner? It's impressive. Don't you think so, Sheppy? The dog sneered. He talks too much. Oh, what do you know? Heidi lifted the scissors into his hands, absently snipped them in the air. They had blood on the blades. They hadn't hours before. Shep doesn't understand men of action like us, John. He's a good dog. Loyal. And the kiddos love him, but he lacks that special spark, you know? He paced the length of the stockade, came back to Lynn, brushed a lock of hair from her face. I don't have time to work out you taking the fall for me, John. The fire is spreading. The floor up there won't last. I can hear the screams. Can't you? John nodded. Yes. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you for one teeny little trick. I want you to kill her, and I let your little boy live. He patted Lynn's head. Deal? Lynn's eyes shot open, wide, urgent. To John, to George, then back again to John. He liked Lynn. There was another life somewhere where he might have loved her, where they could have joked and been normal and happy. He didn't stray from her gaze as he had with the family in the dining room. He collapsed inside, and his wounded calf cackled madly along his nerves. He opened his mouth and breathed. How? Heidi slapped his leg. That's the spirit. Shep, be a good dog and fetch us a can. The dog scampered away and returned with 2 of the demijohns. One sloshed as he set it down. The other toppled, glugging onto the floor. Lynn's eyes burrowed into John, sharp, haunting terror. She shook her head, moaned through her gag. John knew why. He had smelled gasoline when he roused. Now the smell was everywhere. If you burn her, you'll kill us all, John snapped. You know that, right? John said the words, and he thought immediately of the fire upstairs, devouring wood beams and hay bales and synthetic costumes. The smell of it was growing, too. A stray spark falling through the floor might be the end of them now. The fumes alone were enough to make John feel woozy. Burn her? Jesus, this isn't Salem, John. And truthfully, I don't want to kill her. I want to let her go. Back to her happy little life with her happy little kid. But you're going to stop me, John, aren't you? I said you were persuasive. I think if you told me to kill her, I'd probably have to. Lynn shook her head. A final, silent plea. John turned to Lewis, who looked back at him. His son didn't look terrified anymore. He looked confused. John wondered if his son would ever forgive him. If he would ever know how difficult it was to say, "Do it." Do what, Daddy? Kill her. Heidi sighed. He ripped the gag from Lynn's mouth. She begged and shrieked, and John sunk deeper into himself, and Heidi lifted a demijohn. My hands are tied, sweetheart. Sorry. He shrugged, slumping his posture. and with a swift jab, filled her screaming mouth with the yellow spout.
Bottoms up.
The moment stretched as John realized finally what Heidi had planned. He watched Lynn's eyes again, wide then oddly serene. Heidi drew out the moment, his hand motionless. Then Lynn made a sound, and Heidi withdrew the spout.
Yes?
He asked.
You want me to spit or swallow?
She stared up at Heidi, kissed the air. Heidi spun towards John.
And that's how you do a fucking reveal, Daddy.
George's eyes crinkled at the corners. Shep cackled. John's thoughts fled in a stupefying exodus. As Heidi dropped the demijohn, he laughed.
Oh, wow, Lynn, baby, I think we broke his brain.
Lynn pouted.
I did tell you that George's dad was an asshole, didn't I? And in all fairness, it wasn't all pretend. I really did like you, John Carmichael. Sure, you're a little shy, but...
Stop, John snarled.
Aw, you hurt his feelings, Lynn.
The hollow of John's mind was filling with rage. The animals off by the televisions had turned. They grinned, one dabbed at his eye. Nyla's mother's sari remained a ruin. Her body was still. Dead. John didn't know what to trust anymore. He heaved in breaths, his fingers tightening into his fists, and his son still watched him helpless, lost. Lewis had delved into the playhouse with George, and George now looked around the room almost bored. He, like Lynn, was a decoration. Something benign, hiding something sinister.
All right, let's get on with it then, before the building comes down,
Heidi moaned. He lifted the scissors, hung them over Lewis, spread them around his neck.
Any last pieces of fatherly wisdom, Daddy?
What? I did what you said. Lynn frowned from her stalk next to Lewis.
You did, John. It was truly shocking betrayal. Repugnant. Vile. Etc., etc. I guess the wisdom is don't trust people. Anyway.
Heidi opened the blades. Lewis was sobbing again. John's stomach lurched. Please, I don't know what to give you, but take it. Just let him go. Heidi paused. What rage John had gathered was now bleeding away again.
Your face. That is the reason I do it, John. God, it's like a fucking drug, playing with a person like you. But I'm not going to kill your son. We're friends, John. Cut from the same cloth, if you'll pardon the pun. I'm frankly aghast you would think I'm such a monster. I'm not a monster.
Heidi began to pull away the scissors.
But I am a liar.
In a single moment, John, the father, ceased to be. An electric impulse bloomed in Heidi's mind, birthed by a collection of neurons. It traveled down his spine, out into those nerves that fed into his arms, his shoulders, the muscles that wrapped around his bones. One quick twitch. The scissors closed. Lewis was dead. John didn't see the blood. He saw blonde curls and a smiling boy riding a bicycle for the first time. He saw birthday parties and camping trips and tears and laughs and then nothing. His hand moved, shaking, clever fingers. They slipped across his thigh and felt a lump, smooth and rectangular. John's nerves ignored the tear of the barbs through his skin as his fingers found his pocket. As they grasped and then retreated, John's hands remembered something that he had not. A thing he said he would return to Lynn. The metal click was a small sound, meaningless to anyone but a smoker. It tickled John's brain with an almost imperceptible dose of dopamine. Lynn saw it first. Her eyes went wide. She was a gifted actor, but this fear was real. Heidi's eye was always watching. Nothing could hide from it after all. So maybe, just maybe, he saw the lighter before John turned the strike wheel and set a tiny fire that became a big fire. For John, it only took a lifetime for the screams and the heat and the pain to die away. The news ran the story for days, and Benny watched it play on the small television set in the kitchen. Smoke, fire engines, the towering bodies of cranes lifting pitted black beams from a yawning hole in the ground. He missed his friends. Lewis's adventurousness, Terry's compassion. His teacher, Miss Murphy from school, had come to the house sometime after the policemen and before the newsmen. She cried. Benny had never seen that before. He let her hug him. He hugged her back. And over her shoulder, he watched the television. He thanked her for coming. His mother hugged Miss Murphy too. Benny didn't pay much attention. His eyes were on the screen. There was a part in the coverage that they played over and over again. Benny's mother called it ghoulish and in poor taste. Something displayed only for shock value. Maybe she was right. The clip began with a fireman talking to the camera. He pointed to a charred stretch of grass, or maybe the husks of lumber behind. Beside the grass was a sidewalk where two blackened bodies lay. The camera zoomed just a little. Enough to make out the tufts of fur here and there that had come out of the fire unscathed. What the fireman said was unimportant. The two bodies were unimportant too. But the third, it was carried by more firemen, laid down beside the others. The third body was considerably shorter than the two. But when Benny squinted, he could just make out a patch of moppish fur amidst the black. It didn't fix a thing. It didn't make him feel happy or whole. But it made him feel safe. If only for a moment. The story you just heard was written by Jesse Pullins and Jacob Early, also known as A Hawaiian Shirt and Decorative Gentleman on Reddit. Jesse Pullins has a new book out, which you can find on Amazon. I'll link in the description below. And it features this story, as well as multiple others, including a story that he co-wrote with me, and co-wrote a bunch of other stories with a bunch of other amazing authors. So I hope you'll all check that out. Again, please check out the description below for more information about Jesse's book called Seasonal Halloween Store. Thanks everyone for listening. Today's video was supported by patrons like Mark from Earth, Crimson Muse, Joy Burton, Diane Showers, Mark Sewall, Cheryl James, Pick Your Sticker, Teddy Dog, Clue 404, Mamakato, Dante Kincaid, Zarin Ray, Angela Donovan, Larry N50, Devin Kyle, Timothy Baird, Ajeti, Bert Turner, Majani Espinal, Michael Pierce, Big Joe, Kerry Harkonnen, LaDonna Spivey, Scott Tanaka, Tom Stewart, Sherman Davis, Bryce Shelton, Susan McClendon, Elise Batiste, Lisa and the Cult Jam, Open Circuit, Fabulavore, Raymond Jaggers, That Darn Fox, Raisin Detra, Kai Gaming 099, Windy Burns, The Wendigo, Michael Squishy Park. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content, as well as a Discord channel. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward. And if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in the next Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Hope you like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. It really does help a lot. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.